There are winters so cold that God himself seems to look away. The carriage wheels rolled through 8 inches of snow before finally slowing beside the dark line of Blackwood Forest. Inside the carriage, Serafina Veilcrest sat folded beneath a wool blanket that no longer held warmth. Her gloved fingers trembled against the fabric. Not violently. Not enough for anyone to notice unless they were looking for it. No one inside the carriage was looking at her. Her stepmother stared through the frosted window with the rigid patience of a woman waiting for an unpleasant task to end. Her younger half-sister, Lenora, slept against velvet cushions with one hand curled beneath her cheek. Even asleep she looked cherished. Serafina lowered her eyes toward the lantern swinging above them. The weak flame painted gold across the polished interior walls before swaying again with the motion of the carriage. She could hear the storm worsening outside. Wind struck the carriage hard enough to rattle the doors. Snow hissed against the glass. Somewhere beyond the trees, wolves cried into the dark. The sound traveled thin and distant through the storm. Her stepmother finally spoke without turning her head. "How much farther?" The driver answered from outside. "Less than half a mile, ma'am." No, her stepmother adjusted one lace glove slowly. "Stop here." The horses snorted sharply as the carriage came to a halt. Silence settled for one strange moment. Serafina looked up. Her stepmother still had not looked at her. "Open the door," she said. The footman hesitated outside. "Ma'am, the weather." "Open it." The latch clicked. Winter air rushed into the carriage like cold water flooding a grave. Lenora stirred but did not wake. Serafina felt the temperature strike her skin instantly. The breath left her lungs in a thin cloud. "Step out," her stepmother said. Serafina stared at her for several seconds. Not because she did not understand. Because she did. "Madam," she said quietly, "it is 12 degrees outside." Her stepmother finally looked at her then. The woman's face remained perfectly calm beneath the dim lantern light. "And yet you are still speaking." Serafina felt her fingers tighten beneath the blanket. The carriage creaked softly in the wind. "Father knows?" she asked. "Your father knows what he chooses to know." Another gust of snow swept through the open doorway. Lenora shifted again, pulling the fur blanket higher around herself without waking. Serafina watched the movement. Something inside her became very still. Not pain. Pain required surprise. This was older than surprise. Her stepmother leaned back against the seat with visible impatience. "You should be grateful," she said. "Most families would have sent you away months ago." Serafina did not answer. Her illness had lasted 3 weeks. Fever. Weak lungs. Endless coughing that stained handkerchiefs pink at the edges. Doctors had come and gone through the Veilcrest estate whispering outside closed doors. She had heard enough to understand. Infection. Decline. Expense. Her father had stopped visiting her room after the 2nd week. Servants left trays outside the door instead of entering. Even the maids had begun making the sign of the cross before speaking to her. As though sickness itself were a moral failure. "Please," Serafina said softly. Not begging. Only speaking the final truth aloud. "I will not survive out there." Her stepmother's expression did not move. "That is no longer my concern." The words settled quietly between them. The storm screamed against the carriage walls. Somewhere in the distance, branches cracked beneath heavy snow. Serafina looked once toward her sleeping sister. Lenora had one of Serafina's old ribbons braided into her golden hair. The pale blue silk stood out against the cream blanket. Serafina recognized it immediately. She had wondered where it went 2 winters ago. Strange, the things the mind noticed at the edge of ruin. The footman stood outside the open carriage door shifting uneasily in the snow. He could not have been older than 19. He avoided looking directly at her. "Miss," he whispered carefully, "your coat." He held out her cloak with shaking hands. Serafina accepted it slowly. The wool was thin. Not meant for weather like this. She wrapped it around herself anyway. Her stepmother reached toward the opposite seat and picked up a small leather satchel. She tossed it lightly toward Serafina's feet. The bag landed beside the door with a dull sound. "There are $12 inside," she said. "You should consider that generosity." Serafina looked down at the satchel. Then back at the woman who had raised her since childhood. Was I truly such a burden? Her stepmother gave a faint smile then. Cold. Tired. Honest. You were your mother's daughter. Serafina stepped out into the snow. The cold hit instantly. It cut through the thin soles of her boots and climbed into her bones with terrifying speed. Wind tore loose strands of pale hair across her face. The storm smelled like pine trees and ice and distant smoke. Behind her, the footman set the satchel carefully beside the road. He looked as though he wanted to say something. Instead, he stepped back toward the carriage. Cowardice often looked very similar to obedience. Serafina stood motionless in the snow while the carriage door remained open before her. For one impossible second, she thought her father might appear. She imagined his voice calling for the carriage to stop. She imagined footsteps. Regret. Anything. Nothing came. Her stepmother met her eyes one final time. Do not make this uglier than it already is. Then she closed the carriage door. The sound was soft. Softer than Serafina expected. The driver snapped the reins. Horses strained forward through the storm. Wheels groaned against frozen earth. Slowly, the carriage began disappearing into the white darkness between the trees. Serafina watched until even the lantern lights vanished. Snow collected along her shoulders and hair. Her breathing came unevenly now. The fever inside her body made the cold feel distant at first. That frightened her more than the wind did. She bent slowly to pick up the satchel. Her fingers barely obeyed. The road ahead stretched empty beneath the storm. Blackwood forest rose on both sides like walls built from shadow and snow. She could no longer hear the carriage. Only the wind. Only the trees. Only the strange silence that follows after a life ends and another one has not yet begun. Serafina pulled the cloak tighter around herself and took one step forward into the storm. Then another. Her boots sank deep into the snow with each movement. The cold reached her lungs quickly. Each breath burned sharper than the last. She did not know where she was going. That realization arrived calmly. There was no nearby town for miles. No inn. No farmhouse. Nothing except forest stretching endless beneath the winter sky. The fever returned harder after 20 minutes. Her vision blurred at the edges. Dark branches twisted overhead like skeletal fingers against the white sky. Snowflakes clung to her eyelashes. She stumbled once and caught herself against a tree trunk. Bark scraped her glove. Blood warmed briefly beneath the skin before the cold stole the sensation away. She remained there for a moment with one hand against the tree, breathing carefully. The wind had begun carrying strange sounds through the forest now. The distant crack of branches. The rustle of movement beneath heavy snow. Her pulse slowed unexpectedly. Exhaustion settled into her limbs like lead. She knew enough about death to recognize its quieter stages. First pain. Then cold. Then the dangerous comfort afterward. Her knees weakened. She sank slowly beside the base of a pine tree and drew the thin cloak around herself. Snow gathered across the hem almost immediately. Above her, gray clouds moved heavily across the darkening sky. Evening was coming. Serafina tilted her head back against the tree bark and closed her eyes for one moment. Just one. Wind swept through the forest again. Then somewhere far beyond the storm came another sound. Hoofbeats. Slow. Measured. Approaching through the snow. Serafina's eyes opened weakly. At first she thought she imagined it. The rhythm came again. Closer now. One horse. Heavy. Controlled. Not hurried by the storm. The shape emerged gradually between the trees. A massive black horse cutting through falling snow like something carved from shadow itself. The rider wore a long dark coat dusted white along the shoulders. Broad gloved hands held the reins steady. He did not slow immediately upon seeing her. The horse continued forward several more feet before finally stopping. Snow swirled violently around them both. Serafina could not fully see the rider's face beneath the storm and darkness. Only sharp angles. Pale skin. Eyes the color of winter steel. The man looked down at her without speaking. She realized then that he was not surprised to find someone dying beside the road. That frightened her more than anything else had tonight. The black horse exhaled heavily into the cold. The rider finally spoke. His voice was deep and calm and entirely without warmth. "If you can stand," he said, "do it now." Serafina tried to rise immediately. Her hands pressed against the frozen ground beneath the pine tree, but the strength in her arms failed almost at once. The world tilted sharply sideways. Snow blurred into darkness for one terrifying second before she caught herself against the trunk again. Her breathing turned shallow. The rider remained motionless atop the black horse. He did not offer assistance. He only watched her with the stillness of a man accustomed to waiting for weakness to reveal itself naturally. Snow gathered along the broad shoulders of his dark coat without melting. "I cannot," Serafina admitted finally. The words came quieter than she intended. The horse stepped forward once. Powerful muscles shifted beneath black skin gleaming faintly beneath the storm. The rider dismounted in one controlled motion. Boots struck the snow with a dull crunch. Serafina noticed immediately that he moved without hesitation despite the ice beneath his feet. Tall, broad-shouldered, severe in a way that made the forest itself seem smaller around him. The man removed one leather glove slowly before reaching down toward her. His bare hand stopped inches from her face. Not touching, measuring. She realized then he was checking whether she remained conscious. His fingers hovered briefly near her cheek before withdrawing again. The cold seemed unable to touch him. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "I do not know." "That means too long." His voice carried no sympathy, only fact. Serafina lifted her eyes toward him fully for the first time. Snow drifted through strands of dark hair touched silver by the storm. His face belonged to a man carved from harder things than ordinary life. Sharp jaw, pale skin, gray eyes entirely without softness. Yet there was something exhausted beneath the coldness. Something ancient and restrained. Recognition struck her suddenly. Not personal recognition. Social recognition. Every county surrounding Blackwood knew his face. Duke Lucien Ravensshire. The ruthless Duke. Men lowered their voices when speaking his name. Servants crossed themselves after he passed. Stories followed him through every drawing room from Boston to Hartford. Stories of ruined rivals. Silent punishments. Merciless business dealings. Women whispered about him differently. Not with affection. With caution. Serafina felt her pulse weaken further beneath the fever. Of all people to find her tonight, fate had chosen the most dangerous man in New England society. Lucien studied her another moment before speaking again. "Who left you here?" The question landed harder than she expected. Serafina looked away toward the road already half erased by snow. "My family." No reaction crossed his face. "Names." Veilcrest. Something changed then. Small. Nearly invisible. But she saw it. His eyes sharpened slightly. The silence afterward stretched long enough for Serafina to notice the wind again moving through the trees overhead. "Interesting," he said quietly. She frowned faintly through the fever. "You know them." "Unfortunately." He pulled the leather glove back onto his hand with slow precision. "Can you ride?" "Not tonight." No, his gaze moved across her pale face, her trembling hands, the thin cloak failing against the storm. "Not tonight." He turned away then and reached for the horse's reins. Serafina stared at him in confusion. Fear crept cold and sharp beneath her exhaustion. "Wait." He paused without looking back. "Please." Her throat tightened against the cold air. "You are not leaving me here?" The question seemed to stop something invisible inside the storm itself. Lucien stood motionless beside the black horse for several seconds before answering. "If I intended to leave you," he said calmly, "I would not have dismounted." He adjusted the reins once around his gloved hand. Then he crossed back toward her through the snow. Serafina tried instinctively to rise again. Pride survives strange things. Even now, Lucien ignored the attempt completely. One arm slid carefully behind her back while the other moved beneath her knees. His movements remained controlled and precise, as though he were lifting something fragile that he did not entirely trust himself to touch. Serafina stiffened immediately. The shock had nothing to do with fear. Every story she had ever heard about Lucien Ravensshire insisted upon one detail above all others. The Duke despised physical contact. Handshakes ended quickly. Ballroom dances never lasted longer than necessary. Even his own staff avoided brushing against him. Yet now he lifted her from the snow without visible hesitation. Warmth struck her first. Heat radiated through the heavy wool of his coat despite the storm. She realized with disoriented confusion that she could hear his heartbeat beneath layers of fabric. Slow, steady, unmoved by the cold. Lucien carried her toward the horse. Not hurriedly, not awkwardly, as though he had already decided her weight belonged there. Serafina's vision blurred again from fever and exhaustion. She barely noticed him securing blankets around her once she sat atop the saddle. The horse shifted beneath them with restrained power. Lucien mounted behind her a moment later. One arm held the reins while the other remained firm around her waist to steady her against the storm. The contact should have felt improper, dangerous. Instead, for the first time since the carriage doors closed behind her, Serafina stopped shaking. The horse began moving through the forest at a measured pace. Snow continued falling thick and endless through the dark trees. Lucien said nothing for several minutes. Neither did she. Wind swept hard against them from the north. Serafina focused weakly on the rhythm beneath her. Hooves crushing snow. Leather creaking softly. The controlled rise and fall of the horse's breathing. Somewhere in the distance, wolves cried again. Closer this time. Lucien did not react. You are not afraid, Serafina murmured weakly. Of wolves. Of anything. She felt rather than saw the faint shift of his attention toward her. Fear is useful, he said after a moment. Panic is useless. Most people confuse the two. Serafina closed her eyes briefly against another wave of dizziness. And which am I doing? Neither. His voice lowered slightly beneath the storm. You stopped expecting rescue before I arrived. The truth of it settled heavily between them. Serafina opened her eyes again. Snowflakes dissolved against the black leather of his gloves. Why did you stop? She asked quietly. What? On the road. Her breath fogged pale against the air. Most men would have ridden past. Lucien did not answer immediately. Ahead, the forest thickened into shadows beneath the storm. Most men, he said at last, do not recognize a Veilcrest daughter abandoned in the snow. Serafina frowned faintly. You truly know my family. I know enough. His arm tightened subtly around her waist as the horse descended a steep icy path. Your father owes dangerous men a great deal of money. Her body went still beneath the blankets. Lucien noticed. She knew he noticed because his voice became colder afterward. How much did he receive for leaving you there tonight? Serafina stared ahead into the falling snow. I do not understand. No, Lucien said quietly. You do. Silence followed. Her pulse weakened again beneath the fever. She remembered the satchel containing $12. The calm expression on her stepmother's face. The strange urgency surrounding the journey tonight. A terrible thought began forming slowly beneath the exhaustion. Lucien guided the horse between two enormous pines before speaking again. Your family did not abandon you because you were dying. Snow hissed softly against the blankets around her. They abandoned you because someone else intended to find you first. Cold spread through Serafina's chest far deeper than winter. What does that mean? Lucien's jaw tightened once beneath the shadowed storm. It means, he said, you were safer with wolves than with the men waiting farther down that road. The horse continued forward through the forest without slowing. Ahead in the distance, through falling snow and darkness, faint golden lights finally appeared between the trees. Massive, distant, unmoving against the storm like something ancient watching from the hills beyond the forest. Serafina stared weakly toward them while exhaustion pulled at the edges of her consciousness again. Blackmore Hall. Even through the storm, the estate looked less like a home than a fortress waiting beneath the winter sky. Lucien lowered his gaze briefly toward her pale face. Stay awake, he said. We are almost there. Blackmore Hall emerged fully from the storm 10 minutes later like a fortress built to outlive mercy itself. Massive stone walls rose from the cliffs above the frozen river, dark against the white sky, their tall windows glowing gold through swirling snow. Towers cut upward into the night like the edges of broken crowns. Serafina stared weakly at the estate through strands of damp pale hair, while the horse climbed the final steep path toward the front gates. The closer they came, the more unreal the manor appeared. She had heard stories about Blackmore Hall since childhood. Everyone in New England society had. The Ravensshire family wealth stretched across railroads, shipping routes, banks, and old political alliances powerful enough to shape entire states quietly from behind closed doors. Men sought Duke Lucien's approval with the desperation of drowning people reaching for shore. Others feared becoming visible to him at all. It was said he remembered every insult ever spoken in his presence. It was said he destroyed enemies slowly. It was also said no woman had remained inside Blackmore Hall longer than a month since his father's death 13 years earlier. The iron gates groaned open before they reached them. Servants had already seen the Duke returning through the storm. Lanterns flickered along the long curved drive leading toward the manor entrance. Serafina became aware then of how she must look. Fever pale. Exhausted. Wrapped in blankets like something half-frozen dragged from the woods. Shame moved faintly beneath her exhaustion. Lucien appeared untouched by any of it. Snow covered the shoulders of his dark coat, but nothing about him suggested discomfort. The horse climbed the final rise toward the front steps where 6 servants already stood waiting beneath the covered entrance. None of them spoke when they saw her, but Serafina watched the shock move visibly across their faces. One older servant nearly missed the bottom step entirely before catching himself. Another stared openly at the Duke's arm still secured firmly around her waist. Lucien dismounted first. Snow crunched beneath his boots. He reached upward immediately afterward. Serafina tried again to gather enough strength to climb down herself. "I can manage," she whispered. Lucien ignored her completely. One hand settled against her back while the other moved beneath her knees exactly as before. He lifted her from the saddle with calm, effortless precision. The servants froze. Not dramatically. That made it worse. The silence carried genuine disbelief. Serafina felt it instantly. Whatever rules governed Blackmore Hall, the Duke himself carrying a woman across the threshold clearly violated all of them. Lucien started toward the entrance without acknowledging anyone around him. "Your Grace," an older man said carefully beside the doors, "Dr. Whitmore has not yet returned from Hartford." "Then send again." Lucien's voice remained flat and controlled. "Now." "Yes, Your Grace." Warmth struck Serafina the moment they crossed inside. Heat from enormous marble fireplaces rolled through the entrance hall in soft waves carrying the scent of cedarwood and smoke. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead. Dark portraits lined the walls from floor to ceiling, generations of Ravensshire faces watching silently from gilded frames. Everything inside Blackmore Hall felt vast. Vast enough to make ordinary people disappear inside it. Servants moved quickly through the hall ahead of them, lighting additional lamps as Lucien walked deeper into the manor. No one questioned him. No one slowed him. Yet Serafina noticed something strange in their expressions. Fear, yes. Respect, certainly. But beneath both lay another emotion harder to name. Unease. As though the Duke carrying her through Blackmore Hall signaled the beginning of something dangerous. Lucien climbed the grand staircase without breaking stride. Serafina's head rested weakly against the dark wool of his coat. Fever blurred the edges of her vision again. She caught fragments only. Endless corridors. Candlelight reflecting against polished floors. Silent servants stepping quickly aside. Somewhere far below, the front doors opening again against the storm. "Your Grace," a female voice called behind them. Lucien stopped halfway up the staircase. Serafina lifted her eyes weakly toward the woman standing below. Tall. Severe. Silver hair pulled tightly beneath a dark lace cap. The housekeeper, perhaps. Her gaze rested not on Serafina's face but on the Duke's hands holding her. "Which room?" the woman asked carefully. Lucien answered immediately. "The East Wing." The silence afterward felt physical. Several servants lowered their eyes at once. One young maid nearly dropped the armful of blankets she carried. The older woman recovered first. "Your Grace," she said slowly, "those rooms have remained closed since—" "I am aware." His voice cut cleanly through the hall. Nothing loud. Nothing emotional. Somehow that made it far sharper. The woman bowed her head instantly. "Of course." Lucien resumed climbing the staircase. Serafina noticed the servants watching them until the corridor finally curved out of sight behind them. The East Wing stood separate from the rest of the manor beyond a long, dim hallway lined with tall windows overlooking the cliffs. Wind struck the glass hard enough to rattle faintly through the stone walls. Only a few lamps burned here. Most doors remained shut beneath heavy layers of dustless silence. Lucien stopped before a pair of dark wooden doors near the very end of the corridor. He opened them one-handed without setting her down. Warm firelight spilled softly across the hall. Serafina blinked in surprise as he carried her inside. The room was enormous. Not cold or masculine as she expected. Soft gold curtains framed tall windows overlooking the frozen river below. Shelves filled with books lined one wall beside a marble fireplace already burning brightly. A vase of white winter roses rested atop a polished table near the windows. Fresh roses. Not decorative. Maintained. The room did not feel abandoned. It felt prepared. Lucien crossed toward the bed and lowered her carefully against layers of dark green blankets. The mattress sank softly beneath her exhausted body. Heat from the fire reached her skin almost painfully after the hours spent in the storm. Serafina pulled weak breaths into her lungs while Lucien stepped back from the bedside. Distance returned to him immediately once he no longer needed to touch her. "You should rest," he said. She looked around the room again through lingering confusion. "Whose chambers are these?" Lucien removed his gloves slowly beside the fire. "Yours." Serafina stared at him. "Mine. Temporarily." His gray eyes lifted toward her at last. "Unless you prefer returning to the snow." The answer should have sounded cruel. Somehow it did not. Only tired. She studied him carefully through the flickering firelight. The Duke stood near the fireplace with the stillness of a man more comfortable in silence than conversation. Shadows moved sharply across the angles of his face. His expression remained unreadable. Yet exhaustion lingered there again beneath the coldness. Not physical exhaustion. Older than that. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly. Lucien looked into the fire instead of answering immediately. "That is not the question you should be asking." Serafina felt the fever pulse harder behind her eyes. "Then what should I ask?" His gaze shifted back toward her slowly. "You should ask who knew your family would abandon you tonight." The room fell silent except for the crackling fire. Serafina's fingers tightened weakly around the blanket. "You speak as though this was planned." "It was." "By whom?" Lucien walked toward the window overlooking the cliffs. Snow drifted endlessly beyond the glass. "That," he said quietly, "depends on whether your father sold you willingly." A cold wave moved through Serafina despite the firelight surrounding her. "Sold me?" Lucien remained facing the window. 3 months ago your father borrowed $80,000 from men connected to the Grayson shipping syndicate. Serafina stared at him in disbelief. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I own the bank holding his debt." The answer arrived calm and immediate. She felt the room tilt faintly again. Lucien continued before she could speak. "Your father missed 2 payments. Last week he was approached with an alternative arrangement." "I do not understand." No, Lucien's reflection stared back from the dark window glass. "I imagine your family preferred it that way." He turned toward her then. Firelight caught briefly in his gray eyes. "There are men in this country who collect beautiful desperate women the same way other men collect racehorses or paintings." Serafina's throat tightened painfully. "No, yes." The word landed softly. That made it worse. She tried to sit upright too quickly. Dizziness crashed through her instantly. Lucien crossed the room before she could fall sideways from the bed. One gloved hand caught her shoulder with controlled firmness. "Careful." Serafina stared up at him, breathing unevenly now. "You are saying my father intended." She could not finish the sentence. Lucien did not force her to. "The carriage route tonight was not random," he said quietly. "Neither was the timing." Her pulse hammered weakly beneath the fever. "Then why are you here?" Something unreadable crossed his face then. "Gone almost immediately." "Because I intercepted them first." Silence swallowed the room afterward. Firelight moved softly across the walls while snow battered the tall windows beyond them. Serafina looked at the Duke standing beside her bed and understood something instinctively. Lucien Ravenshayer had not found her by accident. He had been waiting for that carriage long before it entered Blackwood Forest. A sharp knock interrupted the silence. The older housekeeper entered carrying folded nightclothes and steaming tea balanced carefully atop a silver tray. Her expression remained perfectly composed until she looked directly at Serafina lying in the Duke's private East Wing chambers. Something flickered across the woman's face then. Shock, recognition, fear. It vanished quickly beneath practiced professionalism. "Dr. Whitmore is on his way, Your Grace," she said carefully. Lucian stepped away from the bed at once. Distance again. Coldness again. Good. The housekeeper set the tray near the fire before turning back toward him. "Will Miss Vailcrest require additional attendance tonight?" Lucian answered without hesitation. "No one enters this room without my permission." The woman's eyes lowered immediately. "Of course, Your Grace." Yet Serafina noticed the slight pause before the housekeeper left. A hesitation almost invisible. As though the order itself disturbed her. The door closed softly behind her. Lucian looked toward the fire once more. "Sleep if you can," he said. "Tomorrow will be considerably more difficult than tonight." Serafina watched him through the flickering firelight while exhaustion slowly pulled her downward again. "Why?" she whispered weakly. Lucian's gaze lifted toward her one final time. "Because by morning," he said quietly, "everyone will know where you are." Serafina did not remember falling asleep. One moment she watched snow striking the tall windows beyond the firelight, and the next she drifted somewhere deep beneath warmth and fever and strange fractured dreams. In one dream she stood again beside the road while the carriage disappeared into white darkness. In another she wandered endless halls lined with portraits whose painted eyes followed her silently through candlelit corridors. She woke sometime later to the sound of voices. Low. Controlled. Male. The room remained dim except for the fire burning lower now within the marble hearth. Heavy curtains concealed the windows completely, shutting out the storm in whatever hour remained outside. Serafina lay still beneath thick blankets while her thoughts slowly gathered themselves again. Her body felt lighter than before. Not healthy, simply no longer frozen. A physician stood near the fireplace packing instruments into a black leather case. Thin silver spectacles reflected the firelight across his lined face. Dr. Whitmore, presumably. Lucian Ravenshair stood several feet away beside the window, one hand resting behind his back while the other held a glass untouched near his side. He still wore black. Somehow he looked exactly as he had hours earlier. Untired. Unmoved. Only the loosened collar beneath his dark coat suggested the night had grown late. "The fever has broken somewhat," Dr. Whitmore said quietly. "Her lungs remain congested, but she is stronger than I expected." Lucian's expression did not change. "Will she survive?" The doctor hesitated briefly. "If she remains warm and rested, yes." Serafina noticed the physician glance toward the bed before lowering his voice further. "Though I suspect exhaustion is not her only condition." Lucian remained silent. Dr. Whitmore removed his spectacles slowly. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "forgive the question, but why is Miss Vailcrest here?" The fire cracked softly in the silence that followed. Lucian finally took one slow sip from the untouched glass before answering. "Because I brought her here. That was not my concern." "I know." Dr. Whitmore studied him for several moments. "By tomorrow afternoon every drawing room from Boston to Newport will be discussing this. They are welcome to discuss whatever amuses them." "Lucian." The physician's voice sharpened slightly with familiarity rare enough to surprise Serafina instantly. "You placed an unmarried woman inside the east wing of Blackmore Hall in the middle of the night. Society will not interpret that kindly." Lucian's gaze shifted toward the fire. "Society rarely interprets anything correctly." The doctor exhaled quietly through his nose. "You are not 20 anymore." "No." "Then stop behaving as though scandal cannot reach you." Serafina watched the Duke carefully from beneath lowered lashes. Not once during the conversation had he glanced toward her bed. Yet she sensed he knew exactly when her breathing changed. Exactly when she woke. Exactly how much she heard. "She was left to die in Blackwood Forest," Lucian said finally. "I will survive gossip." Dr. Whitmore closed the leather case with a soft click. "The Vailcrests claim she disappeared willingly." Serafina's pulse stumbled hard beneath the blankets. Lucian did not move. "According to whom?" "Her father." The physician adjusted his gloves slowly. "Apparently Miss Vailcrest fled the carriage after some emotional episode during travel." Serafina stared at the ceiling above her while something cold settled quietly inside her chest. Of course. Of course they would rewrite the story before dawn. Lucien's voice became softer then. Dangerous in the way winter rivers become dangerous before the ice breaks. Did Arthur Valecrest tell you this personally? He told half the state. Dr. Whitmore paused. He also claimed you may have manipulated the situation. Silence followed. Serafina could feel it changing the room around them. The physician sensed it too. His shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly. Lucien finally set the untouched glass aside atop a small table. Interesting, he said quietly. Dr. Whitmore removed one glove finger by finger. Lucien. What? Do not look at me with that expression. Which expression? The one people see immediately before they lose everything. Serafina turned her face slightly against the pillow. She should not have listened. Every instinct taught her that overhearing powerful men carried danger. Yet exhaustion pinned her beneath the blankets while curiosity held her there just as firmly. Lucien moved toward the fireplace slowly. Firelight cut sharp shadows across the angles of his face. Arthur Valecrest borrowed money from the Grayson Syndicate 6 months ago, he said. He lost nearly all of it gambling on Western Rail expansion. Dr. Whitmore frowned faintly. I heard rumors. The rumors were optimistic. And his daughter? Lucien's gray eyes lowered briefly toward the flames. Collateral. The word entered the room quietly. That made it monstrous. Serafina closed her eyes for one terrible second. Dr. Whitmore went very still beside the fire. My God. Yes. Does she know? Lucien finally looked toward the bed then. Their eyes met instantly. Serafina realized too late she should have pretended sleep longer. The Duke held her gaze steadily across the dim room. Nothing softened in his expression. Nothing cruel appeared there either. Only certainty. She knows now, he said. Dr. Whitmore turned sharply toward her. Miss Valecrest. Serafina pushed herself upright carefully against the pillows. Weakness moved through her limbs immediately, but she ignored it. I am sorry, the physician said quietly. I did not realize you were awake. Neither did I. Her voice sounded thinner than usual. She hated that. Lucien crossed toward the bed then. Not close enough to touch her. Close enough to observe. How much did you hear? He asked. Enough. The fire cracked again behind them. Serafina lowered her eyes briefly toward her hands resting atop the blanket. Pale fingers. Trembling slightly. My father sold me to strangers, she said softly. Saying the words aloud made them real in an entirely different way. Lucien did not deny it. Dr. Whitmore stepped forward carefully. Miss Valecrest, you should not distress yourself further tonight. She laughed once before stopping immediately. Even that small sound exhausted her. I think distress has already occurred, Doctor. His expression softened with visible sympathy. Lucien remained unreadable beside the bed. Serafina looked toward him slowly. You knew. Yes. Before tonight. Yes. How long? The Duke answered without hesitation. 8 days. Something inside her tightened painfully. You knew they intended to abandon me and said nothing? Would you have believed me? The question silenced her instantly. Lucien watched the realization settle across her face before continuing. If I had appeared at your father's house claiming he planned to sell you, what would you have done? Serafina swallowed slowly. You would have defended him. His tone remained calm. Because decent people struggle to recognize evil inside familiar faces. The room fell quiet again. Dr. Whitmore looked increasingly uncomfortable standing between them. Miss Valecrest requires rest, he said gently. Whatever discussion remains can wait until morning. No, Serafina kept her eyes on Lucien. I want the truth now. Something almost resembling approval flickered briefly across the Duke's expression. Gone too quickly to name. The Grayson Syndicate transports women through northern shipping routes, he said. Most disappear before authorities realize they existed. Cold moved through Serafina's body despite the fire. And my father owed them enough money to become useful. Dr. Whitmore looked toward the windows darkened beyond the curtains. The police. Lucien's jaw hardened faintly. Several local officials receive payments through Grayson accounts. So no one stopped them. No one except me. Serafina stared at him silently. The physician gathered the last of his medical instruments while tension settled heavily through the room. You should remain here until your strength returns, Dr. Whitmore said gently to her. Travel would worsen your condition considerably. And afterward? She asked quietly. Neither man answered immediately. That frightened her more than any explanation could have. Lucien finally spoke. Afterward depends on how aggressively your father attempts to reclaim you. Serafina felt her pulse quicken beneath the blankets. Reclaim. Arthur Valecrest cannot repay his debt without you. You speak as though I belong to someone. Lucien's gaze held hers steadily. At the moment, he said quietly, multiple men believe you do. The words settled heavily between them. Dr. Whitmore looked genuinely disturbed now. Lucien. Facts remain facts whether spoken aloud or not. Serafina turned her face toward the fire again. Her thoughts moved strangely calm despite the horror beneath them. Perhaps shock eventually exhausted itself. Perhaps the body simply ran out of fear after enough hours. You said tomorrow will be difficult, she whispered. Lucien remained silent for several seconds before answering. Because by sunrise your father will realize I intervened. And Arthur Valecrest fears losing money more than he fears shame. The Duke adjusted one cuff slowly beneath the firelight. Which means he will attempt to retrieve you publicly before rumors become permanent. Dr. Whitmore stared at him sharply. You think he will come here? Without question. Serafina looked toward the heavy doors of the room instinctively. Blackmore Hall suddenly felt less like safety and more like the quiet center of an approaching storm. Lucien noticed the movement. No one enters this wing without my permission, he said calmly. You are safe tonight. Safe. The word sounded unfamiliar now. Dangerous in its own way. Serafina studied him through flickering firelight while exhaustion slowly pulled at her again. The Duke stood beside the bed dressed entirely in black with snow still melting faintly across the shoulders of his coat. Ruthless men were not supposed to rescue strangers from forests. Ruthless men were not supposed to wait 8 days watching for a carriage in the middle of a snowstorm. Nothing about Lucien Ravensheim made sense. Perhaps that frightened her most of all. A clock somewhere deeper inside the manor struck midnight softly through the walls. Dr. Whitmore gathered his coat at last. I will return tomorrow afternoon, he said. Miss Valecrest needs broth, rest, and no additional stress if possible. Impossible, Lucien replied immediately. The physician almost smiled despite himself. Yes, I suspected as much. He moved toward the door before pausing one final time. Lucien. What? Whatever this becomes, choose carefully. The Duke did not answer. Dr. Whitmore left quietly afterward, the door closing softly behind him. Silence returned to the room once more. Serafina leaned weakly back against the pillows while firelight moved across the ceiling above. Lucien remained standing near the bed without speaking. Why are you still here? She asked eventually. Because you are afraid. Her breath caught faintly. I did not say that. No, his gaze rested steadily on her pale face. You did not. For several seconds neither of them moved. Then Lucien crossed silently toward the fire and added another piece of wood to the flames. Sparks lifted gold into the dim room before fading again. Sleep, he said without turning back toward her. Tomorrow your father arrives. Serafina woke to silence so complete it felt unnatural. For several moments she lay motionless beneath heavy blankets watching pale morning light spill through the tall windows of the east wing. Snow still covered the cliffs beyond the glass in endless white layers broken only by black pine trees, and the frozen silver ribbon of river below. The storm had passed sometime during the night. Blackmore Hall stood utterly still beneath the winter sky. Her fever had lessened. Weakness remained deep in her bones, but the crushing weight inside her chest had eased enough for clear thought to return. Unfortunately, clear thought brought memory with it. Her father. The carriage. The Grayson syndicate. Lucien waiting in the forest before the carriage ever arrived. Serafina closed her eyes briefly. None of it felt entirely real in daylight. A soft knock sounded at the door before it opened carefully inward. The older housekeeper entered carrying a silver breakfast tray balanced neatly between gloved hands. Morning light revealed the woman more clearly now. Tall, controlled, iron gray hair arranged perfectly beneath a dark cap. Her black dress severe enough to resemble morning clothes. "Good morning, Miss Veilcrest," she said quietly. "I hope you rested." Serafina pushed herself upright slowly against the pillows. "Better than expected." The woman crossed toward the bed and placed the tray carefully atop a nearby table. Tea steamed softly beside fresh bread, eggs, and sliced fruit. The scent alone reminded Serafina suddenly how little she had eaten in days. "I am Mrs. Holloway," the housekeeper said. "I oversee Blackmore Hall." Serafina noticed the precise way she avoided saying welcome. "Thank you." Mrs. Holloway adjusted the edge of the tray cloth almost absently. "Dr. Whitmore instructed that you eat before attempting to stand. I am not an invalid." "No," the housekeeper's expression remained unreadable. "But you nearly died yesterday." Silence settled briefly between them. Serafina reached slowly for the teacup, noticing immediately how her hand still trembled faintly beneath the porcelain. Mrs. Holloway noticed too. Nothing escaped that woman's eyes. "Has the Duke already begun working?" Serafina asked quietly. "His Grace begins working before most people wake." "And he has said nothing else regarding my situation?" Something flickered across Mrs. Holloway's face then. Careful hesitation. "His Grace rarely explains himself to anyone, Miss Veilcrest." Serafina lowered her gaze toward the tea. "That does not answer the question." The older woman studied her for several seconds before speaking. "Your father arrived 30 minutes ago." The porcelain cup stopped halfway to Serafina's lips. Cold spread through her body so quickly it almost felt like fever returning. "Already?" "Yes." Mrs. Holloway folded her hands neatly before her waist. "He demanded immediate access to this wing." Serafina's throat tightened painfully. "And the Duke refused." A strange expression crossed the housekeeper's face then. Not satisfaction exactly. Something closer to disbelief. No one recalls the last time Arthur Veilcrest was removed from a room by security. Serafina stared at her silently. Mrs. Holloway adjusted one cuff with careful precision. "Your father was not pleased." "My father rarely notices displeasure unless it belongs to him." The words escaped before Serafina could soften them. Mrs. Holloway's eyes lifted sharply toward her. For one brief moment something changed between them. Recognition, perhaps. The older woman inclined her head slightly afterward. "I will send a maid to assist you dressing once breakfast is finished." "No." Serafina placed the teacup carefully back onto the tray. "I will dress myself." "Miss Veilcrest. Please." Her voice lowered quietly. "I have lost enough dignity already." Mrs. Holloway remained still for several seconds before nodding once. "Very well." She moved toward the door before pausing near the threshold. "One piece of advice, if I may." Serafina looked up. "Do not mistake the Duke's protection for softness." The warning entered the room gently. That made it colder somehow. Mrs. Holloway left without another word. Serafina sat motionless after the door closed behind her. Downstairs somewhere deep within Blackmore Hall, her father waited. The thought alone made her stomach tighten hard enough to ruin any remaining appetite. She forced herself to eat anyway. Small bites. Slow movements. Survival suddenly felt less dramatic than stories claimed. Mostly it involved continuing ordinary actions while frightened. 40 minutes later Serafina stood before the tall mirror beside the fireplace fastening the final buttons of a dark blue dress one of the maids had left neatly folded outside the room. The fabric fit perfectly despite clearly never belonging to her. That unsettled her more than it should have. Nothing inside Blackmore Hall appeared accidental. She brushed pale strands of hair carefully behind her ears before looking at herself fully for the first time since arriving. The woman staring back looked older than she remembered. Exhaustion shadowed the blue-gray of her eyes. Her skin remained too pale from fever and stress. Yet beneath the weakness another expression had appeared quietly overnight. Awareness. Serafina no longer looked like someone waiting to be rescued. A sharp knock interrupted the thought. She turned immediately toward the door. "Come in." The maid entering could not have been older than 17. Freckles dusted her nose beneath nervous brown eyes. Miss Veilcrest, she said quickly. His Grace asked that I escort you downstairs whenever you're ready. Seraphina noticed the girl staring openly at her before quickly lowering her gaze. What is your name? Emily, miss. You seem frightened of me, Emily. The maid looked horrified instantly. No, miss. I only… She stopped herself abruptly. Only what? Emily twisted her hands together nervously. People are talking downstairs. Seraphina almost laughed at the understatement. I imagine they are. No woman has stayed in the East Wing since Lady Evelyn died. Silence entered the room immediately afterward. Emily's face drained of color. She clearly had not intended to say that aloud. Seraphina felt something tighten faintly beneath her ribs. Lady Evelyn? The maid swallowed hard. The Duke's mother. Another small piece of the manor shifted quietly into place then. The locked silence of the East Wing. The servants' reactions. Mrs. Holloway's unease. Seraphina glanced slowly around the room again. Not abandoned. Preserved. Emily stared at the floor now as though expecting dismissal. Instead, Seraphina asked quietly, How long ago did she die? 12 years, miss. And no one has used these rooms since? No, miss. Emily finally risked lifting her eyes briefly toward Seraphina. Until yesterday. A strange feeling moved through Seraphina then. Not fear exactly. Servants moved quietly. Doors opened soundlessly. Even footsteps appeared restrained by invisible rules. As they approached the grand staircase, voices rose faintly from somewhere below. Male voices. One calm. One increasingly sharp. Seraphina slowed instinctively near the landing overlooking the entrance hall beneath. Her father stood near the center of the marble floor dressed impeccably in dark wool despite the strain visible around his eyes. Arthur Veilcrest remained handsome in the careful polished way wealth often preserved men who lacked kindness. Beside him stood Lucian Ravenshair entirely motionless in black. The contrast between them unsettled her instantly. Her father looked agitated. Lucian looked inevitable. You are overstepping yourself, Arthur Veilcrest snapped. My daughter belongs with her family. Lucian's expression did not move. Your daughter was dying beside a road 8 miles from your estate. She fled the carriage. In a snowstorm. She was unwell. Yes. Lucian's voice lowered slightly. I noticed. Arthur's jaw tightened hard enough for Seraphina to see it from the staircase above. You have no legal right to keep her here. And you have no moral right to retrieve her. Silence crashed through the entrance hall afterward. Several servants froze visibly nearby, pretending not to listen. Seraphina gripped the staircase railing lightly as dizziness moved through her again. Her father finally saw her standing above them. Shock crossed his face first. Then relief so immediate it almost looked genuine. Seraphina. He stepped forward instantly. Thank God. The performance would have been convincing if she had not watched him leave her in the snow 12 hours earlier. Lucian turned then. His gray eyes lifted toward her with immediate focus. Not surprise. Assessment. As though checking whether she remained steady on her feet. You should not be standing long, he said calmly. Arthur looked between them sharply. You see, he said quickly. She is ill. She belongs at home. Seraphina descended the staircase slowly, one hand resting lightly against the rail. Every servant in the hall watched her carefully while pretending not to. Her father moved toward the bottom step immediately. Seraphina, my dear, there has been a terrible misunderstanding. She stopped 3 steps above him. Distance suddenly mattered. A misunderstanding. Arthur's smile strained faintly at the edges. Of course. You were feverish. Frightened. Your stepmother and I have been worried sick. Seraphina stared at him silently. She noticed then that he never once asked how she survived the night. Lucian remained several feet away watching the exchange without interruption. You left me beside Blackwood Forest, Seraphina said quietly. Her father's expression flickered. Barely. You insisted on leaving the carriage. In 12-degree weather. You were not thinking clearly. Neither were you apparently. Arthur inhaled sharply. Seraphina. The warning inside her name sounded painfully familiar. Childhood returned in one terrible instant. Obedience. Silence. smiling politely while adults rewrote reality around her. But something inside her had frozen and broken apart in the snow the night before. "Did you sell me?" she asked softly. The entire hall went still. Arthur stared at her in open disbelief. "What nonsense has Ravensshire filled your head with?" Lucian finally spoke again from across the marble floor. "Answer the question." Arthur turned sharply toward him. "Stay out of this." "Impossible." The word landed flat and cold. Serafina watched her father's composure begin slipping beneath the pressure. Small things revealed it. The tightening jaw. The rigid shoulders. The pulse visible near his temple. "You are exhausted," Arthur said quickly to her again. "Come home and we will discuss everything privately." "No," the answer surprised even her with its steadiness. Silence followed instantly. Arthur blinked once as though genuinely unfamiliar with hearing refusal from her. Lucian did not react outwardly at all. Yet Serafina noticed his gaze sharpen slightly. "Serafina," her father said carefully now, "you do not understand the position you are placing yourself in." "I understand it perfectly." Her hands trembled faintly at her sides. She ignored that too. "You abandoned me." Arthur took one step closer toward the staircase. "I was trying to protect this family. From debt. From ruin. By sacrificing me." His silence answered clearly enough. Something collapsed quietly inside her then. Not dramatic. Not loud. Simply final. Lucian watched it happen. She knew he did because his expression changed almost imperceptibly afterward. Colder somehow. Arthur straightened slowly. Whatever softness he attempted moments earlier disappeared completely. "You will come home now," he said firmly. "No," the single word echoed softly through the entrance hall. Arthur's eyes hardened. "You are still my daughter." "Am I?" Serafina asked quietly. "Because yesterday I was collateral." The marble hall fell silent enough to hear the distant ticking of a clock somewhere deeper inside the manor. Arthur looked toward Lucian then with open hatred finally replacing pretense. "This is your doing." Lucian's face remained unreadable. "No," he said calmly. "This is yours." Arthur Veilcrest recovered faster than most men would have. Serafina realized then that survival among powerful people often depended less on morality than adaptability. Her father straightened slowly beneath the crystal chandeliers of the entrance hall, and smoothed one hand across the front of his dark coat as though composure itself could rewrite the last several minutes. "You are exhausted," he said calmly, "and clearly influenced." Serafina remained still on the staircase. Lucian stood several feet away near the center of the marble floor watching Arthur with the quiet patience of a man observing something already decided. "Influenced," Serafina repeated softly. "By whom?" Arthur spread his hands slightly. "By a man with his own motives." Lucian's expression did not move. "Careful." The single word cut cleanly through the hall. Arthur ignored him completely. "You think Ravensshire intervened out of kindness?" he asked her sharply. "Men like him do not rescue women from forests without expecting payment afterward." The servants nearby lowered their eyes immediately. No one breathed too loudly. Serafina looked toward Lucian instinctively. The Duke remained utterly still beneath the morning light pouring through the high windows. No anger appeared across his face. That frightened her more than anger would have. Arthur noticed her glance and pressed forward immediately. "Come home now," he said, "before this situation becomes impossible to repair." "Repair?" Serafina descended one additional step slowly. "You sold me. I protected this family. By trading your daughter." Arthur's jaw tightened visibly. "You understand nothing about the pressure I have carried these past months." "Then explain it." The demand entered the hall quietly enough to force silence around it. Arthur blinked once. Serafina continued before fear could return. "Explain why $12 were left beside the road." Something flickered across her father's face. Surprise perhaps. He had not expected her to notice the satchel. "You were never meant to be harmed," he said carefully. "The arrangement guaranteed comfort." Serafina felt cold spread through her body despite the heated hall. "Comfort? You would have lived well." "Owned well," Lucian corrected softly. Arthur turned sharply toward him. "Enough." No. Lucian stepped forward once across the marble floor. The movement itself altered the room instantly. Servants stiffened. Even the air seemed to tighten around him. You do not raise your voice inside my house while discussing the sale of your daughter. Arthur's face flushed darkly. She is still legally under my authority. Not anymore. Silence crashed heavily through the hall. Serafina stared at Lucian instantly. Arthur did the same. The Duke's expression remained unreadable. What exactly does that mean? Arthur asked slowly. Lucian reached inside the inner pocket of his coat and removed several folded papers. Cream-colored. Official. Arthur's face drained of color before the documents were even opened. No, he said immediately. Lucian handed the papers calmly toward him. Your debts were transferred at 8:30 this morning. Arthur stared down at the pages with visible disbelief. His fingers tightened hard enough to wrinkle the edges. You purchased the Grayson accounts. Yes. That is impossible. No. Lucian's voice remained level. Expensive. Not impossible. Serafina looked between them in growing confusion. Arthur read further across the documents before lifting furious eyes toward the Duke. You cannot simply absorb $80,000 in debt and expect. I absorbed considerably more than that. Lucian interrupted him quietly. Your rail losses were embarrassing. Arthur's breathing sharpened visibly now. Why? The question escaped him before pride could stop it. Lucian glanced briefly toward Serafina standing above them on the staircase. Because I dislike human trafficking. Arthur laughed once then. Harsh. Empty. Do not pretend morality suddenly interests you. Something changed in Lucian's eyes then. Not visible rage. Worse. Absolute stillness. You are correct, he said softly. It usually does not. The silence afterward felt dangerous enough to touch. Arthur folded the papers sharply in his hands. This changes nothing. Incorrect. Lucian adjusted one cuff with slow precision. Your debts now belong to me. Which means your agreements with the Grayson Syndicate no longer exist. Arthur stared at him. You think they will simply walk away? No. Lucian's gaze sharpened faintly. I think they will redirect their anger toward the man who failed them. Serafina watched fear move visibly across her father's face for the first time in her life. Real fear. Not social embarrassment. Not wounded pride. Fear. Arthur looked suddenly older standing beneath the chandeliers. Smaller somehow. You are making a mistake, he said quietly. Lucian's expression remained unchanged. Perhaps. Those men are not civilized. Neither am I when necessary. The entrance hall fell completely silent afterward. Serafina felt her pulse stumble faintly at the words. Lucian did not sound threatening. He sounded factual. Arthur understood that difference too. She saw it immediately in the way his shoulders tightened. You would risk conflict with Grayson over a woman you do not even know? Arthur asked. Lucian looked toward Serafina again. Something unreadable passed briefly across his face before vanishing beneath control. Apparently. The answer unsettled everyone in the room equally. Arthur recovered first. And what exactly do you intend now? Lucian turned slightly toward the windows overlooking the snow-covered cliffs. Miss Veilcrest will remain here until she chooses otherwise. Arthur laughed again without humor. You expect society to believe you are sheltering an unmarried woman out of charity? I do not particularly care what society believes. You should. Arthur stepped closer. Because by tonight every newspaper in Boston will imply she is your mistress. Serafina felt humiliation rise hot and immediate beneath her skin. Several servants shifted uncomfortably nearby. Lucian did not react outwardly at all. Then your daughter will become considerably more interesting to society than she was yesterday. Arthur's expression hardened completely. You are ruining her reputation. Lucian finally looked directly at him again. You attempted to sell her to criminals. The words entered the hall quietly enough to become unbearable. Arthur's face went pale beneath the morning light. Lower your voice. Why? Lucian asked calmly. Ashamed suddenly? Serafina gripped the staircase railing harder. The weakness from illness remained dangerously close beneath her skin. She could feel exhaustion creeping slowly back through her limbs. Lucian noticed instantly. Of course he did. His gaze shifted toward her briefly. You should sit down. Arthur turned sharply toward her as well. Serafina. His voice softened again with practiced precision. Come home. We can settle this privately before things become irreversible. She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who taught her to ride horses when she was 6. The man who once carried her asleep from a carriage after summer parties. The man who now stood beneath crystal chandeliers arguing legal ownership over her life. Things already became irreversible, she said quietly. Arthur inhaled sharply. You are making this harder than necessary. No, Serafina's fingers trembled faintly against the railing. You did that yesterday. Silence spread again through the hall. Arthur stared at her with something dangerously close to resentment now. Not grief. Not guilt. Resentment that she refused to cooperate quietly with her own destruction. Lucien saw it too. His face became colder by degrees. Leave Blackmore Hall, he said softly. Arthur looked toward him slowly. You cannot bar me from my own daughter. Watch me. The answer arrived calm enough to chill the entire room. Arthur held Lucien's gaze several seconds too long. Some instinct finally warned him against continuing. He folded the debt papers once more before slipping them inside his coat. This is not finished. No, Lucien agreed. It is not. Arthur looked toward Serafina one final time. Whatever performance of fatherly concern remained had vanished completely now. You believe he saved you, he said quietly. You should ask yourself why. Serafina did not answer. Arthur's jaw tightened once before he turned sharply toward the front doors. Servants moved immediately aside as he crossed the entrance hall and disappeared beyond the towering marble columns. Seconds later, the heavy front doors slammed shut somewhere in the distance. Silence remained behind him like dust settling after collapse. Serafina exhaled slowly without realizing she had stopped breathing. Her knees weakened instantly afterward. The world tilted sideways for one dangerous moment. Lucien crossed the distance between them before she could fall. One gloved hand steadied her elbow firmly against the staircase railing. The contact lasted only seconds. Long enough for warmth to cut through the lingering cold beneath her skin. Long enough for her pulse to betray itself completely. Lucien released her immediately afterward. Distance again. Always distance. You should not have come downstairs, he said quietly. Serafina tried to steady her breathing. I needed to hear him say it. Lucien studied her pale face for several moments. And she looked toward the closed front doors far below. I think part of me believed he would deny everything convincingly enough to make me doubt myself. Lucien's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He has spent years teaching you to doubt yourself. The accuracy of it struck harder than she expected. Serafina lowered her gaze briefly toward the marble floor below. You purchased his debts this morning. Yes. That amount of money would ruin most families. The Ravensshire family will survive the hardship. The dryness beneath the answer nearly startled a laugh from her. Nearly. Lucien looked toward the servants still frozen uneasily throughout the hall. Leave us. The staff disappeared instantly. Within seconds only silence remained beneath the chandeliers and morning light. Serafina became suddenly aware of how alone they truly were inside the enormous hall. Lucien remained standing one step below her on the staircase. Close enough now for her to notice faint silver threads near his temples beneath dark hair. Close enough to see exhaustion hidden carefully behind his eyes. Why did you really do it? She asked softly. The debts. The forest. All of it. Lucien looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Somewhere outside beyond the tall windows, snow began falling lightly again across the cliffs. Because, he said at last, some things should not be bought. The answer should have sounded noble. Somehow coming from him it sounded personal instead. That frightened her more than anything else he had said. A clock struck somewhere deeper inside the manor. Serafina realized suddenly how quiet Blackmore Hall had become after her father's departure. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt waiting. Lucien seemed to sense the same thing. His gaze shifted briefly toward the massive front doors below. Arthur will not stop, he said calmly. Men drowning in debt rarely surrender useful assets peacefully. Serafina's throat tightened faintly. You keep speaking about me as though I am still in danger. Lucian's eyes returned to hers steadily. You are. The library of Blackmore Hall occupied nearly the entire western side of the manor. Seraphina realized that the moment Lucian opened the double oak doors later that afternoon and warm golden light spilled across endless shelves stretching upward 2 full stories beneath painted ceilings darkened by age and candle smoke. Massive windows overlooked the frozen river below. Snow drifted steadily beyond the glass while firelight moved softly across leather bindings and polished wood. The room smelled faintly of cedar, ink and old paper. It felt less like a library and more like a private kingdom built from silence. Seraphina stopped just inside the doorway. This is larger than the Hartford Public Archive. Lucian crossed toward a table near the fireplace already covered with papers and opened correspondence. It should be, he replied calmly. I purchased half of Hartford's archive in 1912. She looked toward him sharply. Why? Because someone else wanted it. The answer arrived so dryly she almost smiled despite herself. Almost. Lucian removed his gloves slowly and placed them beside a stack of documents. He had changed clothes after Arthur Vailcrest's departure. The black coat remained. Everything always remained black with him. Only the crisp white collar beneath his jacket broke the darkness sharply against pale skin. Seraphina stood quietly near the doorway while her strength continued returning in small uncertain waves. She no longer felt feverish. That should have comforted her. Instead it left too much room for thought. Blackmore Hall unsettled her in ways difficult to explain. Nothing inside the estate appeared accidental. Not the room prepared for her arrival. Not the servants' reactions. Not Lucian intercepting the carriage before she reached the forest road. He moved like a man following plans written long before anyone else saw them. Sit, Lucian said without looking up from the documents spread across the table. You still look unsteady. Seraphina crossed slowly toward the fireplace and lowered herself into one of the dark leather chairs nearby. Warmth wrapped softly around her from the flames. Outside the windows the world remained frozen white and distant beneath the falling snow. Inside the library only the quiet turning of paper disturbed the silence. She watched Lucian work for several minutes before speaking. What are you doing? Preventing problems. That sounds vague intentionally. It is. He signed one document quickly before setting it aside. The Grayson Syndicate lost a considerable amount of money because of me yesterday. Because you bought my father's debts. No, Lucian finally lifted his eyes toward her. Because I interrupted an exchange already negotiated. Cold settled faintly beneath her ribs again. How many people knew? Too many. He leaned back slightly against the edge of the table. Your father. 2 Grayson representatives. Several transportation contacts. Transportation. The word sounded terrible now. Lucian noticed immediately. You do not need details. I think I do. Silence followed briefly. Then Lucian crossed toward a nearby cabinet and poured water into a crystal glass before handing it toward her. Seraphina accepted it carefully. Their fingers nearly touched. Nearly. Women disappear every year through northern ports, he said quietly. Most families report them as voluntary departures to avoid scandal. And no one investigates? Some do. His gaze shifted toward the snow beyond the windows. Most investigations end quickly when wealthy men become uncomfortable. Seraphina looked down into the water trembling faintly inside the crystal glass. You speak as though you have seen this before. Lucian did not answer immediately. Firelight moved softly across the sharp angles of his face. I have. Something in his voice stopped further questions before they formed. Silence returned afterward. Comfortable silence did not exist around Lucian Ravensshire. Every quiet moment beside him felt layered with things unsaid. Seraphina slowly drank the water while studying the enormous library surrounding them. Books lined every wall from polished floor to painted ceiling. Ladders rested against towering shelves. Maps covered one section of the western wall beside framed shipping routes marked carefully in dark ink. Her gaze stopped there. Shipping routes. Lucian followed her line of sight immediately. You monitor ports. Yes. For the syndicate? Among other things. She looked toward him slowly. You expected this to happen before my father even left Hartford, did you not? Lucian held her gaze steadily across the room. Yes. Then why did you wait? The question entered the library quietly enough to sharpen the silence around it. Lucian's expression did not change outwardly. Yet something colder moved behind his eyes briefly. Because until Arthur Valecrest acted openly, I could not legally intervene. So you watched? Yes. The honesty of it unsettled her more than excuses would have. Serafina looked toward the fire again. That must have been difficult for you. No, his answer arrived immediately. It was irritating. She almost laughed before stopping herself. You truly are impossible to read. Good. Fire cracked softly behind them. Lucian returned toward the table and gathered several papers together neatly. You should understand something clearly, Miss Valecrest. What? Your father will attempt reconciliation soon. Serafina frowned faintly. After this morning? Especially after this morning. Lucian slid the documents into a leather folder with careful precision. Arthur Valecrest now understands he cannot retrieve you through pressure. Then why continue trying? Lucian looked toward her evenly. Because men protecting reputations become dangerous when desperate. Serafina rested the untouched glass against her knee. You think he cares about reputation more than losing me? Lucian said nothing. He did not need to. She looked away first. Somewhere deep within the library a clock ticked softly through the silence. Snow continued drifting outside the tall windows beyond the firelight. The quiet should have felt peaceful. Instead, tension moved invisibly beneath every conversation. Mrs. Holloway warned me not to mistake your protection for softness, Serafina said eventually. Lucian's attention shifted toward her again. She was correct. Then why protect me at all? You asked that repeatedly. Because you avoid answering. Something almost resembling amusement flickered briefly across his face. Gone immediately afterward. Perhaps I dislike repetition. Perhaps you dislike honesty. The words escaped before caution could stop them. Silence followed instantly. Serafina felt heat rise faintly into her cheeks. Lucian studied her across the firelit library for several long seconds. Most people fear offending me, he said quietly. Most people are not trapped inside your house after being sold by their families. Another silence. Different this time. Lucian's gaze sharpened faintly. Fair point. She blinked once in surprise. He sounded almost human for half a second. The realization unsettled her strangely. A sharp knock interrupted the room before either spoke again. Mrs. Holloway entered carrying a sealed envelope atop a silver tray. Her expression remained perfectly composed until she noticed Serafina sitting near the fireplace beside the Duke's work table. Another tiny hesitation. Another almost invisible reaction quickly hidden. Your Grace, she said quietly. A message arrived from Boston. Lucian accepted the envelope immediately. His eyes moved once across the seal before opening it. Serafina watched the change happen gradually as he read. Not dramatic. Not visible to most people perhaps. But she noticed his shoulders becoming slightly stiller. His expression colder by degrees. What is it? She asked softly. Lucian folded the letter once before answering. Your father has already contacted the newspapers. Mrs. Holloway lowered her eyes immediately. Serafina felt dread tighten through her stomach. What did he tell them? Lucian handed the letter silently toward her. She took it carefully. The article draft attached inside carried a headline already prepared for publication by morning editions. Heiress flees family home with reclusive Duke. Serafina stared at the words while cold spread slowly beneath her skin. No, Lucian remained motionless beside the table. Arthur claims you disappeared willingly after becoming emotionally compromised by my attention. Her hands tightened faintly around the paper. This is absurd. Truth rarely concerns newspapers. She continued reading. The article described secret meetings that never occurred. Emotional instability she never displayed. Suggestions of scandal carefully vague enough to destroy a woman's reputation without direct accusation. Serafina lowered the paper slowly. He is trying to protect himself. Yes. By destroying me publicly. Also yes. Mrs. Holloway stood silent near the doorway while tension spread heavily through the library. Lucian finally crossed toward the fireplace again. There will be more stories by evening. How many papers? Serafina asked quietly. Most major cities by tomorrow. She looked down at the article once more. People will believe this. Some will. Lucian's voice remained calm. Others already hated Arthur Vailcrest enough to suspect worse. That does not help. No, he stopped beside the fire, looking down briefly into the flames. It does not. Serafina folded the paper carefully despite the shaking beginning again in her hands. Humiliation arrived differently than fear. Colder somehow. More intimate. She imagined strangers reading fabricated stories over breakfast tables, while discussing her character casually between coffee and market reports. I should leave, she whispered suddenly. Both Lucian and Mrs. Holloway looked toward her immediately. That would be unwise, the housekeeper said carefully. Serafina stood slowly from the chair near the fireplace. My presence here is making things worse for you. Lucian's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Sit down. The newspapers already imply. I do not care what newspapers imply. His voice remained low. That made the command far more effective. Serafina looked at him steadily. But I do. Silence spread through the library again. Lucian crossed toward her slowly then. Not threatening. Somehow more dangerous because of that. He stopped several feet away beneath the firelight. Listen carefully, he said quietly. If you leave Blackmore Hall now, Arthur Vailcrest will reclaim control of this narrative entirely. Serafina swallowed faintly. And if I stay? Then he loses the ability to decide what happens next. She looked toward the snow beyond the windows. People will think. People think many things. Lucian interrupted softly. Most of them are irrelevant. His gray eyes held her steadily across the firelit silence. What matters is whether you survive this long enough to reclaim your own name afterward. The words settled deeply somewhere beneath her fear. Reclaim your own name. No one had ever spoken to her as though she possessed ownership over her own future before. Mrs. Holloway shifted quietly near the doorway. Your Grace, she said carefully, there is one additional matter. Lucian looked toward her. What? The housekeeper hesitated very slightly. A guest arrived 30 minutes ago. I was not informed. She insisted the matter was personal. Something unreadable crossed Mrs. Holloway's face then. Unease perhaps. Lady Vivian Ashcroft is waiting in the south parlor. Serafina noticed the shift instantly. Tiny. Controlled. But real. Lucian became completely motionless beside the fire. Mrs. Holloway continued carefully. She claims she intends to stay for several days. Silence entered the library heavily afterward. Serafina looked between them without understanding fully why the atmosphere had changed so suddenly. Then she saw it. For the first time since entering Blackmore Hall, Lucian Ravensshire looked genuinely displeased. Of course she does, he said quietly. Lady Vivian Ashcroft entered the library 20 minutes later carrying winter itself around her shoulders like something decorative rather than inconvenient. Serafina understood immediately why servants throughout Blackmore Hall had become nervous at her arrival. Vivian belonged to the kind of old American aristocracy that transformed wealth into authority so completely people obeyed before realizing they had been commanded. Tall and elegant in dark emerald silk, she crossed the library with slow controlled grace while snow melted faintly along the hem of her coat. Her beauty did not resemble softness. It resembled precision. Black gloves. Dark hair pinned perfectly beneath a small velvet hat. Sharp green eyes that missed nothing. She stopped several feet from Lucian beside the firelit table, and removed one glove finger by finger. You did not answer my telegram. Lucian remained standing near the windows overlooking the snow-covered cliffs. I rarely answer threats. Vivian's mouth curved faintly. And yet I arrived anyway. Her gaze shifted toward Serafina then. Calm. Direct. Measuring. Serafina felt instantly examined in ways deeper than appearance. So this is Miss Vailcrest. The silence afterward stretched just long enough to become intentional. Serafina rose slowly from the leather chair near the fire despite lingering weakness. Lady Ashcroft. Vivian inclined her head slightly. You look healthier than the newspapers implied. Lucian's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. You have been here less than 30 minutes. And already 6 reporters attempted speaking with my driver outside the gates. Vivian removed the second glove. Your scandal appears extremely popular. Serafina lowered her gaze briefly toward the folded newspaper article still resting beside the fireplace. Shame moved coldly beneath her skin again. Vivian noticed instantly. Do not concern yourself too much with newspapers, she said calmly. Most journalists are simply disappointed playwrights. Vivian. Lucien's voice carried warning beneath its softness. What? She crossed toward the fireplace without looking at him. I am trying to be kind. You should appreciate the rarity. Serafina watched the strange tension moving invisibly between them. Familiarity. Old history. Neither appeared comfortable with the other. Vivian settled gracefully into the chair opposite Serafina before folding one leg neatly over the other. You rescued her from Blackwood Forest, she said to Lucien. Not a question. Lucien remained motionless near the windows. Yes. And placed her in the east wing. Also yes. Vivian looked toward Serafina again. Something unreadable flickered briefly across her face. Not cruelty. Not judgment. Recognition perhaps. Interesting. Lucien's jaw tightened faintly. You did not travel 4 hours through snow to discuss architecture. No. Vivian accepted the tea Mrs. Holloway silently placed beside her moments later. I traveled because Boston society currently believes you kidnapped a wealthy heiress during an emotional collapse. Boston society embarrasses itself constantly. True. Vivian stirred sugar slowly into her tea. But this particular embarrassment involves your name attached permanently to hers. Serafina remained very still in the chair beside the fire. Hearing herself discussed so clinically felt strangely unreal. Like watching someone else's life from a distance. Lucien finally crossed toward the fireplace. State your point. Vivian looked at him steadily over the edge of the porcelain cup. My point is simple. If Arthur Vailcrest continues controlling public conversation, Miss Vailcrest becomes ruined whether she remains here or not. Serafina's throat tightened faintly. Lucien said nothing. Vivian continued calmly. By tomorrow afternoon every ballroom in New England will assume she willingly became your mistress. Fire cracked softly behind them. And? Lucien asked quietly. Vivian lowered the teacup carefully onto its saucer. And eventually even lies become difficult to separate from memory. Silence spread heavily through the library afterward. Serafina looked toward the snow beyond the windows. Somewhere outside the wind had strengthened again, carrying white drifts against the glass in soft relentless waves. What exactly are you suggesting? She asked finally. Vivian's green eyes returned toward her immediately. I am suggesting you stop allowing men to define your narrative. The answer surprised her enough to silence every prepared defense instantly. Vivian leaned back slightly in the chair. Arthur Vailcrest survives because he understands society values confidence over truth. Lucien survives because people fear him enough not to ask questions. You unfortunately possess neither advantage yet. Lucien's expression sharpened faintly. Careful. Vivian ignored him entirely. Miss Vailcrest currently appears passive within this scandal. That makes you vulnerable. Serafina folded her hands carefully together against her lap. What would you have me do? Appear publicly. Lucien spoke immediately. No. Vivian looked toward him with visible impatience. You cannot lock her inside Blackmore Hall indefinitely. Watch me. Lucien. Her voice hardened slightly now. Isolation will only confirm the rumors. Serafina looked between them quietly. Appear publicly where? Vivian's gaze shifted back toward her. The Ashcroft Winter Ball tomorrow evening. Silence crashed instantly through the library. Even Mrs. Holloway near the doorway looked startled. Lucien's face became completely unreadable. Absolutely not. Vivian raised one eyebrow. You object quickly for a man who claims not to care about society. I care about unnecessary risk. There will be 400 guests present. Half the newspapers in Boston. Every political family worth mentioning. Vivian folded her gloves slowly across her knee. If Miss Vailcrest enters publicly beside you looking healthy, composed, and entirely unashamed, Arthur's narrative weakens immediately. Serafina felt anxiety twist sharply through her chest. A ballroom full of strangers discussing me sounds less like strategy and more like execution. To her surprise, Vivian almost smiled. Excellent. You are intelligent enough to understand high society accurately. Lucian crossed toward the fireplace with controlled stillness. She is recovering from illness. She is recovering from betrayal, Vivian corrected quietly. There is a difference. Firelight moved sharply across Lucian's face as he looked toward Serafina. You are not attending. The certainty inside his voice should have ended the discussion. Somehow it only deepened the tension surrounding it. Vivian watched him carefully then. Interesting. Lucian's eyes narrowed faintly. What is? You. She tilted her head slightly. I have known you 15 years. You usually treat people as movable objects. Yet suddenly you are making decisions emotionally. Incorrect. Then let her answer herself. Silence spread again. Serafina became suddenly aware that both of them were looking at her now. Waiting. Measuring. The pressure of it tightened her pulse immediately. I do not know enough about society games to survive something like that, she admitted quietly. Vivian leaned forward slightly. Good. Overconfidence destroys women faster than gossip ever does. Vivian. What? She looked toward Lucian without fear. You are not helping by glowering at me like a disappointed executioner. Something dangerously close to irritation crossed his face. Serafina realized then how unusual this conversation truly was. No one else challenged Lucian Ravenshire openly. Not servants. Not businessmen. Not even her father. Yet Vivian spoke to him as though entirely immune to intimidation. You trust her, Serafina said quietly before thinking better of it. Silence followed immediately. Vivian's eyes flickered toward Lucian. The Duke remained motionless beside the fire. No, Vivian answered first. I simply know where the bodies are buried, metaphorically speaking. Lucian exhaled once through his nose. The sound almost resembled restrained exhaustion. Your sense of humor remains catastrophic. And yours never existed at all. Mrs. Holloway quietly withdrew from the library then, sensing perhaps that the room had shifted into something more private. Serafina watched Lucian carefully while he stared into the fire several long seconds without speaking. The ball creates visibility, he said finally. Visibility creates opportunity. Vivian nodded once. Exactly. Arthur will attend. Of course he will. Serafina felt cold settle instantly beneath her ribs. My father will be there? Vivian looked toward her calmly. Along with every person currently discussing your reputation over lunch. Lucian's expression became colder by degrees. Which is precisely why she will not attend. You are overestimating your ability to protect people through isolation again. The sentence entered the room softly enough to sharpen everything around it. Lucian looked toward Vivian slowly. Something old and unpleasant moved briefly between them. Serafina saw it instantly. History. That situation was different, he said quietly. Vivian's gaze did not move from his face. Was it? Silence crashed heavily through the library afterward. Serafina looked between them with growing confusion. Lucian turned away first. Enough. Vivian leaned back once more. Very well. But something in her expression suggested she had already learned exactly what she came here to confirm. Serafina lowered her eyes toward the firelight moving across the carpet beneath her shoes. A ballroom tomorrow night. Hundreds of strangers. Whispered conversations. Public humiliation waiting beneath crystal chandeliers. The thought alone tightened her chest painfully. Yet beneath the fear another feeling moved quietly. Anger. Small still. Weak from years of silence. But alive. Vivian studied her carefully from across the fire. You are thinking about it. Serafina looked up immediately. No, yes. Vivian's green eyes sharpened faintly. Because part of you understands hiding only helps your father. Lucian stepped toward the fireplace then. The discussion is finished. Vivian sighed softly. There he is again. The dictator of Blackmore Hall. And yet you continue visiting. Only because irritating you remains one of life's few dependable pleasures. Against all logic, Serafina almost smiled again. This time she actually did. Small. Brief. Barely there. Lucian noticed instantly. His gaze shifted toward her for one strange suspended second before becoming unreadable again. Vivian noticed that too. Of course she did. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly afterward. Not surprise. Realization. "Oh," she said quietly. Lucien's jaw tightened immediately. "Do not start." "I did not say anything." "You were about to." Vivian lifted her tea calmly. "Perhaps." Serafina looked between them uncertainly while tension gathered invisibly once more beneath the fire-lit room. Outside the windows, snow continued falling steadily across Blackmore Hall. Inside the library, for the first time since arriving at the estate, Serafina understood something dangerous clearly. She was no longer merely surviving events around her. She had become the center of them. Serafina could not sleep that night. Snow continued falling across Blackmore Hall long after midnight while wind pressed softly against the tall windows of the east wing. The manor remained unnaturally quiet beneath the storm. Somewhere deep inside the estate, distant clocks marked each passing hour with muffled chimes that only made the silence feel larger afterward. She sat near the fireplace wrapped in a dark wool blanket staring into the flames while thoughts moved restlessly beneath her exhaustion. The Ashcroft Winter Ball. Hundreds of strangers. Her father's lies spreading through every newspaper in Boston by morning. And Lucien Ravenshayer standing motionless beside the fire saying no with absolute certainty, as though danger itself answered to him personally. Serafina closed her eyes briefly. The problem was not that she feared the ball. She did. Terribly. The problem was that Vivian Ashcroft had been right. Hiding inside Blackmore Hall meant allowing other people to define her life publicly while she remained silent. She had spent years doing exactly that already. A soft knock interrupted the room. Serafina straightened immediately. "Come in." The door opened slowly, revealing Lucien standing beneath the dim hallway light beyond. He still wore black. Of course he did. Snow dusted the shoulders of his coat lightly as though he had been outside moments earlier despite the late hour. "You should be asleep," he said quietly. Serafina lowered the blanket slightly around her shoulders. "So should you." Lucien closed the door behind himself before crossing toward the fireplace. The room changed instantly when he entered. Smaller somehow. More aware of itself. "Mrs. Holloway informed me you refused dinner." "I was not hungry." "That was not intelligent." Serafina almost smiled faintly at the wording. Not unkind. Simply factual. Lucien stopped several feet away from her chair near the fire. Shadows moved sharply across his face beneath the low golden light. "You are still weak." "I am also still angry." Something unreadable flickered briefly across his expression. "Anger is useful in moderation. And dangerous otherwise?" "No." His gaze rested steadily on the fire. "Exhausting otherwise." Silence settled softly between them afterward. Serafina studied him carefully while he stood motionless near the flames. The Duke looked exactly like the stories society told about him. Cold. Severe. Impossible to approach safely. Yet those same hands had carried her from the snow without hesitation. Those same eyes had watched her father with quiet fury beneath Blackmore Hall's chandeliers. Nothing about him aligned cleanly together. "Did Vivian leave?" she asked eventually. "No." Lucien's mouth flattened faintly. "She intends to remain until after the ball." "You sound unhappy about that." "Vivian enjoys interfering in situations she considers emotionally interesting. And this situation interests her." Lucien finally looked toward her directly. "Unfortunately." Serafina tightened the blanket slightly around herself. "She thinks I should attend." "I know. You disagree." "Yes." The certainty inside the answer arrived immediately. She watched the firelight shift across the sharp lines of his face. "Why?" Lucien remained silent several seconds before answering. "Because people become cruelest when they smell weakness publicly. Your father will be there." "I know. So will the Grayson representatives." Cold spread sharply through her body despite the firelight surrounding them. "What?" "Vivian does not know that yet." Lucien crossed one arm behind his back. "But they will attend." Serafina stared at him. "How do you know?" "Because people with money rarely miss opportunities to observe damaged investments." The teacup trembled faintly in her hands. "You think they would approach me publicly?" "I think they would enjoy watching whether I stop them." Silence crashed heavily through the room afterward. The fire cracked softly between them. Serafina tried to steady her breathing carefully. Then perhaps you are right. Lucien said nothing. Perhaps remaining hidden is safer. His gaze remained fixed on the flames. Yes. Yet something in the answer sounded wrong somehow. Not dishonest. Incomplete. Serafina studied him carefully through the shifting firelight. But Lucien's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. But what? You dislike the idea for another reason. Silence stretched. Lucien looked toward her slowly. You are observant when frightened. I was observant long before that. For several seconds neither moved. Then Lucien turned away first. Public attention changes people. You mean it destroys them? Sometimes. His voice remained quiet. Sometimes it teaches them exactly how disposable society considers women. Serafina felt the strange weight beneath his words immediately. Personal weight. Someone taught you that once. The room became completely silent. Lucien stood motionless beside the fire. She realized suddenly she had crossed into territory no one else dared approach. Yet he did not become angry. Somehow that unsettled her more. Vivian talks too much, he said at last. Vivian barely said anything. She implied enough. Serafina lowered the untouched tea toward her lap. Lady Evelyn. Lucien's eyes lifted toward hers instantly. There it was again. That strange dangerous stillness. Emily told you. Only that no one stayed in the east wing after your mother died. Firelight moved sharply through the room between them. Lucien finally crossed toward the tall windows overlooking the cliffs and snow beyond. My mother enjoyed society, he said quietly. Parties, charity boards, political dinners. His reflection stared back darkly against the window glass. People adored her publicly. Serafina listened without speaking. Then my father lost part of the Ravensshire fortune during a banking collapse. Lucien's voice remained calm enough to become terrible. The same people who praised her elegance spent 2 years humiliating her in newspapers afterward. Something cold settled beneath Serafina's ribs. What happened? Silence lingered several moments too long. She stopped leaving the east wing. The answer entered the room softly enough to break something invisible inside it. Serafina looked slowly around the firelit chamber again. The preserved furniture. The untouched elegance. The silence lingering through every hallway. This was her room. Yes. Lucien kept his gaze fixed on the storm outside. After she died, I closed the entire wing. Understanding moved quietly through Serafina then. Not complete understanding. Enough. And now I am here. Lucien turned back toward her finally. His expression remained unreadable. Yes. The fire cracked again between them. Why? She whispered. The question carried far more than the room itself now. Why her? Why this wing? Why the forest? Why any of it? Lucien stared at her several long seconds without answering. Then a sudden sharp knock cut through the silence before he could speak. Mrs. Holloway entered immediately afterward, unusually pale beneath the dim hallway light. Your Grace. Lucien's attention shifted instantly. What is it? The housekeeper clasped both hands tightly before her waist. There are men at the gates. Every muscle in Serafina's body tightened immediately. My father. No, Mrs. Holloway swallowed carefully. The Grayson representatives. Silence fell hard across the room. Lucien's expression changed instantly. Not surprise. Calculation. Coldness settling visibly beneath his skin. How many? 3 vehicles. Mrs. Holloway's voice lowered. They claim they only wish to discuss unresolved financial matters. Serafina felt fear rise sharply through her chest. Lucien noticed immediately. He crossed toward her before she fully realized he moved. Stay here. Lucien. Lock the door after me. His voice remained low and absolute. Mrs. Holloway looked genuinely unsettled now. Should I contact the police? Lucien's mouth flattened faintly. No, Your Grace. The police already work for Grayson. The words entered the room like winter itself. Serafina rose too quickly from the chair. Dizziness struck instantly. Lucien caught her elbow automatically before she could stumble. Warm gloved fingers tightened briefly around her arm. You said they would not come here. I said they would observe. His eyes darkened faintly. Apparently I underestimated how impatient they became. Serafina looked toward the closed door beyond Mrs. Holloway. Somewhere far below inside Blackmore Hall, distant voices echoed faintly through the corridors. Men arriving. Men expecting something. What do they want? She whispered. Lucian held her gaze steadily. You. The room fell silent except for the storm striking softly against the windows. Serafina felt her pulse begin hammering painfully beneath her ribs. Lucian released her arms slowly afterward. Distance again. Always distance. Yet his gaze never left her face. Lock the door, he repeated quietly. And do not open it for anyone except me. Then he turned and walked out into the dark hallway beyond while Mrs. Holloway hurried after him. Seconds later the heavy door closed behind them both. Serafina stood motionless beside the fire listening to the lock slide softly into place from the outside. Only then did she realize something terrifying clearly. Lucian Ravensshire had never once looked worried about her father. But the moment the Grayson men arrived at Blackmore Hall, the entire atmosphere of the manor changed. For nearly 20 minutes Serafina remained motionless beside the fireplace listening to Blackmore Hall breathe around her. The manor no longer sounded silent. Voices traveled faintly through distant corridors beneath the storm outside. Doors opening. Footsteps moving quickly across polished floors. Once, somewhere far below the east wing, a man's raised voice cut sharply through the quiet before disappearing again. She could not distinguish words. Only tension. The fire burned lower beside her while snow continued striking the tall windows in soft endless waves. Serafina tightened the wool blanket around her shoulders and tried unsuccessfully to steady her breathing. The Grayson representatives had come to Blackmore Hall personally. Not businessmen sending letters. Not lawyers. Men arriving at midnight during a snowstorm because Lucian Ravensshire had interfered with something important enough to provoke immediate response. She looked toward the locked door again. Fear felt different now. More focused. Less helpless than before. Her father betrayed her for money. The Grayson men wanted ownership. But Lucian frightened them. That realization remained the strangest part of all. Another voice echoed faintly through the corridor beyond the room. Female this time. Calm. Controlled. Vivian. Serafina moved quietly toward the door before stopping herself. Lucian had told her not to open it. The memory of his expression before leaving still lingered sharply in her mind. Not panic. Never panic. Calculation edged with something colder. She stepped back from the door immediately afterward. The room suddenly felt too small to contain her thoughts. Restlessness moved beneath her skin in slow, sharp currents. She crossed toward the windows overlooking the cliffs and pressed trembling fingertips lightly against the cold glass. Below, Blackmore Hall stretched across the snow-covered grounds like a fortress surrounded by darkness. Lanterns glowed near the front entrance where several black vehicles remained parked beside the steps. Men moved faintly through the storm outside. Security, perhaps. Or worse. Serafina closed her eyes briefly. Somewhere inside the manor Lucian was facing people dangerous enough to unsettle even him. A sudden memory surfaced without warning. You are observant when frightened. She opened her eyes again slowly. Then something else returned. The maps in the library. The shipping routes marked carefully in dark ink. The locked east wing preserved untouched for 12 years. Lucian waiting beside Blackwood Forest before her carriage ever arrived. None of it fit together cleanly. Not yet. But the edges were beginning to align into something larger than simple rescue. A soft sound interrupted her thoughts. Metal. Faint. Somewhere behind the western wall of the chamber. Serafina turned immediately toward the source. Silence followed several seconds before the sound came again. A subtle click beneath the bookshelves lining the far side of the room. She frowned faintly. The noise had not come from the hallway. It came from inside the room itself. Curiosity moved faster than caution before she could stop it. Serafina crossed slowly toward the shelves near the fireplace where shadows gathered heavily beneath the dim light. The east wing remained strangely warm despite the winter outside. Yet as she approached the shelves, colder air brushed faintly across her skin. She stopped beside the dark wooden cases lined with old leather books. Another click sounded softly, then silence. Serafina stared carefully at the carved wood along the wall. One section appeared slightly different from the others, barely noticeable. A thin gap hidden between decorative molding and polished oak. Her pulse quickened. "This is a terrible idea," she whispered softly to herself. She pressed one cautious hand against the panel anyway. Nothing happened. Serafina exhaled slowly. Then her fingers brushed against a small iron latch nearly invisible beneath the carving. The panel shifted inward immediately with a quiet mechanical sound. Cold air spilled softly from the darkness beyond. Serafina froze. A hidden passage? No, not a passage exactly. A concealed room. Smaller than the chamber itself but still large enough to hold shelves, cabinets, and a heavy oak desk positioned beneath low burning lamps. Her pulse stumbled sharply. Someone had been here recently. The lamps remained lit. Fire burned quietly inside a smaller marble hearth along the far wall. Papers covered the desk in carefully organized stacks. Serafina stared into the hidden room while every instinct warned her to step away immediately. Instead, she crossed the threshold slowly. The concealed door remained partially open behind her. Warm firelight flickered softly across the walls, revealing maps, ledgers, correspondence files, and newspaper clippings pinned carefully along dark velvet boards. The entire room felt less like a study and more like an investigation frozen into physical form. Her breath slowed painfully inside her chest. Every board, every file, every marked newspaper clipping, all connected to the same thing. The Grayson Syndicate. Shipping routes. Missing women. Financial records. Political names. Serafina moved closer toward the nearest board with growing disbelief. Dates stretched backward nearly 7 years. Photographs attached beside articles describing disappearances from Boston, Hartford, Providence, and New York. Some women smiling elegantly beside society headlines. Others barely remembered at all. A terrible understanding began forming slowly beneath her ribs. Lucien had not stumbled into this situation accidentally. He had been tracking Grayson operations for years. Her gaze shifted toward the massive map spread across the far wall. Red pins marked routes between ports and estates. Black pins marked names. Arthur Vailcrest's name appeared among them. So did dozens of others. Politicians. Banking families. Shipping companies. Serafina stepped backward slowly. My God! Then she saw herself. Not physically. On paper. A folder resting partly open atop the desk carrying her name written in precise black ink. Serafina Vailcrest. Her hands trembled instantly. No, she crossed toward the desk before fear could stop her. The folder contained letters. Newspaper clippings. Financial reports regarding her father's debts. Medical notes. Transportation schedules. Pages and pages of information about her life assembled with terrifying thoroughness. Serafina flipped through them in stunned silence. School records. Charity appearances. Her mother's death announcement from 13 years earlier. Even small details she barely remembered herself. Writing injuries. Piano recitals. Her first public debut at 18. Every piece preserved carefully inside the file. Her pulse hammered violently now. This was impossible. No ordinary investigation required this level of detail. Then she found the oldest document. A photograph. Worn at the edges from age. Serafina stared down at the image while cold spread through her entire body. A summer lake beneath bright sunlight. 2 children near the water's edge. One little girl kneeling beside a dark-haired boy soaked completely through his clothes. The girl could not have been older than 10. Pale hair braided loosely over one shoulder. Blue ribbon around her wrist. Serafina's breath caught sharply. The ribbon. The same pale blue ribbon Lenora wore in the carriage. Her fingers tightened around the photograph. Memory crashed into her all at once. A summer gathering near Ravensshire Lake 14 years earlier. A boy falling through broken dock ice near the shore. Adults screaming. Servants running too slowly. And Serafina herself climbing into freezing water because no one else reached him in time. The dark-haired boy coughing violently against the dock afterward, while she wrapped her own blue ribbon around his bleeding hand. Her knees weakened instantly. No, the photograph shook visibly between her fingers now. Lucien. The boy in the water had been Lucien. Another paper slipped partially loose from beneath the photograph. Serafina pulled it free slowly. Handwritten notes covered the page in sharp, precise script. Subject demonstrates consistent pattern of self-sacrifice despite social isolation within family structure. High probability Arthur Vailcrest will leverage daughter financially under sufficient pressure. Monitor continuously. Serafina stared at the handwriting with growing horror. Lucien's handwriting. Continuous monitoring. The room tilted faintly around her. She moved through the remaining documents faster now. More photographs. More notes. More observations spanning years. Not obsession exactly. Worse. Protection. Calculated. Quiet. Relentless protection. Every major event in her life appeared documented somewhere inside the files. Her pulse thundered painfully against her ribs. What are you doing? The voice behind her entered the hidden room softly enough to stop her heart completely. Serafina turned sharply. Lucien stood motionless in the concealed doorway beneath dim firelight. Snow still dusted the shoulders of his black coat. One leather glove remained in his hand as though he removed it moments earlier while entering. His gray eyes moved slowly from the photograph trembling between her fingers to the open files spread across the desk. Silence crashed heavily through the hidden room. Serafina could barely breathe. "You knew me," she whispered. Lucien said nothing. Before the forest. Still silence. The truth settled itself anyway. She looked around the room once more. The files. The photographs. The years of records hidden beneath Blackmore Hall. How long? Her voice shook despite every effort to steady it. Lucien remained completely still near the doorway. Then finally he answered. 14 years. The hidden room fell completely silent after the words left his mouth. 14 years. Serafina stared at Lucien across the dim firelit space while the photograph trembled faintly between her fingers. The sound of snow striking the windows beyond the concealed walls seemed impossibly distant now. Everything narrowed toward the man standing motionless near the doorway. 14 years. Not days. Not weeks. Years. You followed my life for 14 years, she whispered. Lucien did not move. I monitored it. That is not better. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. No, Serafina looked around the hidden room again with growing disbelief. The files. The notes. The photographs arranged carefully across the walls. Her childhood preserved in documents she never knew existed. Why? Lucien crossed slowly into the room then. Shadows shifted sharply across his black coat beneath the low burning lamps. Because 14 years ago you nearly drowned saving someone you did not know. Serafina's pulse hammered painfully beneath her ribs. I was a child. So was I. Children do not build secret rooms full of surveillance afterward. Silence followed instantly. Lucien's gaze lowered briefly toward the photograph still in her hands. Most children are not taught that debts must eventually be repaid. The answer unsettled her in ways she could not fully explain. Serafina placed the photograph carefully back onto the desk before her shaking fingers damaged it. You turned gratitude into obsession. Lucien's expression became very still. Incorrect. Then what would you call this? She gestured sharply toward the walls surrounding them. You documented my entire life. I documented threats around your life. That is not the same thing. No, his voice lowered slightly. It is more dangerous. The hidden room seemed smaller suddenly. Warmer. Harder to breathe inside. Serafina stepped backward slowly from the desk while trying unsuccessfully to steady the confusion moving through her chest. You watched me for years and never spoke to me. Yes. Why? Lucien remained silent several moments before answering. Because proximity creates vulnerability. She almost laughed then. Not from amusement. From disbelief. You sound as though human relationships are military operations. Most are. The calm certainty beneath the answer chilled her instantly. Serafina crossed both arms tightly around herself. Did Vivian know? Partially. Mrs. Holloway? No, no one. Lucien looked toward the files lining the walls. No one. The realization landed heavily between them. This room existed entirely outside the rest of Blackmore Hall. Outside society. Outside ordinary explanation. A private world hidden behind polished walls and locked corridors. Serafina looked slowly back toward the file carrying her name. You said my father became dangerous under pressure. Yes. When did you first realize that? Lucian crossed toward the desk and closed several open folders with quiet precision before answering. Your mother died 13 years ago. Serafina froze instantly. What? Arthur Valecrest changed after her death. Firelight moved sharply across Lucian's face as he continued calmly. Financial instability, gambling, increased debt acquisition, social aggression. Her throat tightened painfully. You investigated my family. I investigated the men surrounding you. That included my father. Yes. Serafina lowered her eyes briefly toward the photograph again. Her mother smiling softly beside her during a garden party years earlier. The image rested near the edge of the desk, half hidden beneath financial reports. Did you know her? Lucian's expression shifted faintly. Margaret Valecrest saved my mother's life once. Serafina blinked slowly. What? Before you were born. He folded one pair of gloves carefully beside the desk. There was a fire during a charity gala in Hartford. My mother became trapped inside the West Ballroom. Serafina stared at him silently. Margaret returned into the building for her. Another piece shifted quietly into place. Our families knew each other. Once. Lucian's gaze darkened faintly. Before Arthur destroyed most of those relationships himself. Serafina moved slowly toward one of the velvet boards along the wall. Names stretched across documents connected by thin black lines. Politicians. Shipping owners. Judges. How large is this? She whispered. Lucian followed her gaze. Larger than you want it to be. The Grayson Syndicate. Yes. Human trafficking. Among other operations. Her stomach tightened sharply. And you have been fighting them alone. Lucian's mouth flattened faintly. Not alone. Who helps you? Silence answered first. Then finally. Very few people. Something about the answer carried exhaustion deeper than physical fatigue. Serafina turned back toward him slowly. You could have gone to the authorities. Many authorities belong to Grayson financially. Then federal investigators. Some disappear. The words entered the room quietly enough to become terrible. Serafina looked away immediately afterward. Snow struck softly against hidden windows somewhere beyond the walls. Fire cracked low inside the hearth. The men downstairs tonight, she said carefully. What happened? Lucian's expression became unreadable again. They left. That does not answer the question. No, he crossed toward the fireplace at the far end of the hidden room. It does not. Serafina studied him carefully through the dim light. You frightened them. Good. Lucian. The use of his name escaped before caution could stop it. Silence followed instantly. His eyes lifted toward her. Something shifted invisibly between them. Strange. Dangerous. What did you do? She asked softly. Lucian looked into the flames instead of answering immediately. 5 years ago, Grayson attempted acquiring shipping control through one of my western ports. His voice remained calm. 3 executives involved lost everything financially within 6 months. Serafina felt cold move through her chest. You destroyed them. No, his gaze stayed fixed on the fire. I exposed them. And the difference matters to you. Very much. The hidden room fell silent again afterward. Serafina realized suddenly how close they stood now compared to before. Only several feet separated them beside the firelight. Close enough to notice faint shadows beneath his eyes. Close enough to see exhaustion hidden carefully beneath control. You should be angry, Lucian said quietly after a moment. She frowned faintly. About what? This room. His gaze shifted toward the walls surrounding them. The files. The monitoring. Serafina looked slowly around once more. I do not know what I am yet. Honesty settled heavily between them. Lucian inclined his head slightly as though acknowledging the answer. Fair. She crossed toward the desk again and touched one of the folders lightly with trembling fingertips. You kept records of my entire life. Yes. Why preserve things like school recitals and newspaper mentions? Silence lingered too long. Then finally Lucian answered. Because your father stopped noticing you. The word struck harder than anything else he had said tonight. Serafina looked up sharply. Lucian remained motionless beside the fire. People become vulnerable when they believe no one sees them clearly, he continued quietly. I preferred ensuring someone did. Her throat tightened painfully around sudden unexpected emotion. That is not normal. No, he accepted the accusation without resistance. It is not. Firelight moved softly through the hidden room. Serafina stared at him while confusion and fear, and something far more dangerous twisted together beneath her ribs. Gratitude, perhaps. No, not gratitude exactly. Recognition. For the first time in years, someone had watched her existence carefully enough to notice when she disappeared. The realization terrified her. You waited for my carriage in the forest because you already knew the route. Yes. And if I had never been abandoned? Lucian's expression darkened faintly. Then Arthur Valecrest would still owe Grayson $80,000 tomorrow morning. You had contingency plans. Several. She laughed once softly, then stopped herself immediately. You planned my rescue like a military campaign. I dislike improvisation. Despite everything, a faint unwilling smile touched her mouth briefly. Lucian noticed instantly. The room became strangely quiet afterward. He looked at her differently now. Not colder. Worse. More openly. Serafina felt it immediately beneath her skin. This is dangerous, she whispered before fully understanding why she said it aloud. Lucian's gaze held her steadily across the firelight. Yes. Neither moved. Snow continued falling outside Blackmore Hall, while hidden files and forgotten years surrounded them in silence. Then suddenly another sound echoed faintly beyond the concealed wall. Footsteps. Fast. Mrs. Holloway's voice followed moments later from somewhere inside the east wing. Your Grace. Lucian's expression changed instantly. Controlled again. Distant again. He crossed toward the concealed entrance and opened the hidden panel halfway. Mrs. Holloway stood outside, visibly pale beneath the hallway lamps. What is it? Lucian asked quietly. Lady Ashcroft requests you downstairs immediately. The housekeeper swallowed carefully. Arthur Valecrest has returned. Serafina felt cold sweep sharply through her body. Lucian's face hardened. Alone. Mrs. Holloway hesitated. No, Your Grace. Silence fell briefly. He brought reporters. The entrance hall of Blackmore Hall looked different with reporters inside it. Smaller somehow. Dirtier. Men in dark winter coats clustered beneath crystal chandeliers with notebooks tucked beneath gloved hands while melting snow spread across polished marble floors the servants had already cleaned twice that evening. Flash cameras rested beside dripping umbrellas near the front doors. Every servant in sight appeared tense enough to shatter. Serafina stopped halfway down the grand staircase with one hand tightening unconsciously around the railing. Below her, Arthur Valecrest stood near the center of the hall wearing controlled outrage like formal evening attire. Beside him waited 3 newspaper reporters and 1 photographer already preparing equipment beneath the harsh electric lights. Vivian Ashcroft leaned calmly against one marble column, watching the entire spectacle unfold with sharp green eyes and visible disgust. Lucian stood directly opposite Arthur near the foot of the staircase. Black coat. Black gloves. Absolute stillness. The room seemed arranged unconsciously around him. No one stood too close. Not even the reporters. Serafina realized instantly that her appearance had not been expected yet. Arthur saw her first. His face transformed immediately into public concern polished carefully for witnesses. Serafina. The photographer turned instantly toward the staircase. Bright light exploded across the hall as the first flash ignited. Serafina flinched involuntarily. Lucian moved before thought fully formed. One sharp step placed him directly between the cameras and the staircase above. No photographs, he said quietly. The photographer hesitated. Arthur spread one hand dramatically toward the reporters. You see, he announced loudly. My daughter is being isolated from her own family. Vivian rolled her eyes openly from across the hall. Arthur, she said dryly, if you become any more theatrical, someone will charge admission. Arthur ignored her completely. Serafina, come downstairs. His voice softened artificially. Please. These people are only here because I am worried about you. Another camera flash exploded toward the staircase. Lucian turned his head slowly toward the photographer. I warned you once. The room went silent instantly. The photographer lowered the camera immediately afterward. Serafina descended the remaining stairs slowly despite the pounding pulse beneath her ribs. Reporters watched her with predatory focus sharpened by scandal and expensive coats. She understood suddenly what Lucien meant about public cruelty. It did not resemble rage. It resembled appetite. "Miss Veilcrest," one reporter called carefully, "is it true you fled willingly with the Duke? Miss Veilcrest, were you promised marriage? Miss Veilcrest, did your father attempt preventing the relationship?" The question struck rapidly through the hall before she reached the bottom staircase. Serafina stopped completely. Her throat tightened painfully. Arthur stepped toward her immediately. "Enough," he said loudly toward the reporters while ensuring every word remained visible and noble. "My daughter is clearly distressed." Lucien's expression darkened faintly. Vivian watched Arthur with open contempt now. "You should consider acting lessons professionally," she murmured. Arthur ignored her. Again. "Serafina," he said gently, "you do not belong here. Come home." Serafina looked at him silently beneath the chandelier light. Her father looked perfect tonight. Concerned. Elegant. Reasonable. Exactly the kind of man newspapers preferred believing. Then she looked toward Lucien standing several feet away. No performance. No explanation. Only dangerous stillness waiting beneath black wool and pale firelight. "Miss Veilcrest," another reporter asked carefully, "did the Duke intervene in your family affairs against your wishes?" Arthur stepped closer instantly. "She is exhausted. This conversation is inappropriate." "No," Serafina said quietly. Silence crashed through the hall. Arthur blinked once. "Serafina?" "No," her voice steadied slightly now. "I was not abducted." The reporters immediately lifted notebooks higher. Arthur's jaw tightened faintly. "My dear, you are confused." Lucien became completely motionless beside the marble columns. Serafina noticed it instantly. Watching. Waiting. "I was left beside Blackwood Forest during a snowstorm," she continued softly. "The Duke found me there." The photographer raised his camera again instinctively before visibly reconsidering under Lucien's gaze. Arthur laughed once sharply. "You ran from the carriage after an emotional episode. In 12-degree weather. You were hysterical." "No," Serafina's fingers trembled faintly against her skirts. "I was inconvenient." The entrance hall fell utterly silent. Even the reporters stopped writing momentarily. Arthur's expression hardened beneath the chandeliers. "Be careful what accusations you repeat publicly." Vivian straightened slowly from the column where she leaned. "Interesting choice of wording, Arthur." Serafina felt fear moving through her body in sharp cold waves. Yet beneath it something else remained alive now. The memory of hidden files. Of 14 years. Of someone quietly refusing to let her disappear. "Did you leave me beside the forest willingly?" she asked her father directly. Arthur's eyes flickered toward the reporters surrounding them. "This is not the place for family disputes. Answer the question." Another silence. Heavy this time. Dangerous. Arthur smiled tightly toward the reporters instead. "My daughter has been manipulated by an unstable environment and a man with questionable intentions." One reporter turned immediately toward Lucien. "Your Grace, how do you respond to accusations that you exploited Miss Veilcrest's vulnerable condition?" Lucien finally spoke for the first time in several minutes. "I do not respond to stupidity." The answer landed flatly enough to stun half the room silent. Vivian looked almost pleased. Arthur's face darkened visibly. "You see," he snapped toward the reporters. "Threats. Isolation. Controlling behavior." "Arthur," Vivian interrupted coldly, "you attempted selling your daughter to criminals." Every reporter in the hall froze. Arthur turned sharply toward her. "Watch yourself." No, Vivian crossed slowly toward the center of the hall. Emerald silk moved softly beneath chandelier light while every eye followed her instantly. "I think tonight I would rather watch you." The reporters began writing furiously now. Arthur's composure cracked visibly at the edges. "Those accusations are absurd." "Fortunately," Vivian said calmly, "Lucien documents everything obsessively." Serafina felt Lucien's attention shift instantly toward Vivian. Warning. Arthur noticed too. "Documents." one reporter asked sharply. Vivian smiled faintly. Financial transfers. Transportation schedules. Syndicate connections. Arthur's face lost color. You cannot prove. I can prove enough. Lucien's voice entered the hall softly enough to silence everyone again. He crossed toward Arthur slowly. Black coat. Black gloves. Controlled inevitability. And unlike you, he continued quietly, I do not require newspapers to weaponize truth. Arthur stepped backward once before catching himself. Serafina saw it clearly. Fear. Real fear. You would destroy a respected family publicly over rumors? Arthur demanded. No. Lucien stopped directly before him beneath the chandeliers. I would destroy a man who attempted trafficking his daughter. The words settled through the hall like breaking glass. Silence followed immediately afterward. One reporter lowered his notebook completely. Another stared openly at Arthur now with visible revulsion. Arthur's breathing sharpened. You cannot say that without evidence. Lucien removed one leather glove slowly. I never speak without evidence. Something changed in the room then. The balance shifted visibly. The reporters sensed it first. Their attention turned away from Serafina almost entirely now and toward Arthur instead. Toward the possibility of scandal larger than romance. Bigger. Darker. Real. Arthur realized it too late. This is extortion, he snapped. No. Lucien's gaze remained steady and cold. This is consequence. Another camera flash burst suddenly across the hall. Lucien turned instantly toward the photographer. The man lowered the camera again so quickly he nearly dropped it. Serafina watched everything through the pounding rush of her pulse. The reporters. Arthur unraveling beneath pressure. Vivian observing with razor-sharp calm. And Lucien standing in the center of it all like winter itself given human form. Not defending himself. Defending her. Miss Veilcrest, one older reporter asked quietly now, are you remaining at Blackmore Hall by choice? The question entered the silence carefully. Respectfully. Serafina looked toward Lucien instinctively. He did not move. Did not answer for her. For the first time since entering the hall, she understood clearly that he would allow her to decide this publicly herself. Fear tightened beneath her ribs. So did something stronger. Yes, she said softly. Arthur stared at her in disbelief. Serafina. She looked directly at him beneath the chandelier light. I am staying because it is the first place in a very long time where someone noticed I was missing. Silence followed. Absolute silence. Lucien's expression changed almost invisibly beside her. Not softness. Something deeper. Arthur looked suddenly unable to breathe properly. Vivian lowered her eyes briefly as though recognizing something private inside the moment. The older reporter closed his notebook slowly. I think, he said carefully toward the others, we have enough for tonight. No one argued. The atmosphere inside Blackmore Hall had changed completely now. The reporters gathered equipment quietly beneath the chandeliers while avoiding direct eye contact with Lucien. Arthur remained frozen near the center of the hall watching Serafina, as though seeing someone unfamiliar standing where his obedient daughter once existed. Finally he spoke again. Quietly this time. You are making a mistake. Serafina looked at him steadily. No, she whispered. I think you already made it. Arthur's face hardened one final time. Then without another word he turned sharply and walked toward the front doors. The reporters followed quickly behind him into the storm outside. Vivian exhaled softly once the doors closed. Well, she murmured. That escalated beautifully. No one answered her. The hall remained heavy with silence and melting snow and the aftermath of something irreversible. Serafina suddenly realized her hands were shaking violently now that the adrenaline had faded. The strength holding her upright began slipping dangerously fast. Lucien noticed instantly. Of course he did. He crossed toward her before dizziness fully struck. One steady gloved hand closed carefully around her wrist. Warm. Firm. Real. Enough, he said quietly. You are done for tonight. Serafina looked up at him through exhaustion and lingering fear, and something far more dangerous growing quietly beneath both. You planned all of this, she whispered. Lucien's gray eyes held her steadily beneath the chandelier light. No. Then why does it feel like you already knew exactly how tonight would end? For one strange suspended second, something unguarded flickered across his face. Gone almost immediately. Because, he said softly, I knew you would stop being afraid eventually. By morning the newspapers belonged to her. Blackmore Hall woke beneath pale winter sunlight and headlines spread across New England like fire racing through dry fields. Valecrest scandal connected to shipping syndicate. Ravensshire exposes financial corruption. Heiress denies abduction claims publicly. Serafina sat quietly beside the east wing windows while snow drifted softly beyond the cliffs, and servants moved through the manor carrying newspapers folded beneath their arms with visible fascination. Blackmore Hall no longer felt silent. Felt awake. Mrs. Holloway entered shortly after breakfast carrying the Boston Herald atop a silver tray. The reporters published faster than expected, she said carefully. Serafina accepted the paper slowly. Her own face stared back from the front page beside Lucien's beneath the headline. Not ruined. Not hysterical. Calm. Standing beside the Duke beneath Blackmore Hall's chandeliers while Arthur Valecrest disappeared into the storm behind them. Vivian entered moments later wearing dark blue silk, and the expression of a woman personally delighted by social catastrophe. Congratulations, she announced smoothly. You survived public humiliation and accidentally became admirable. Serafina lowered the newspaper slightly. That sounds unlikely. Most admirable things are. Vivian poured tea calmly beside the fire. Boston society currently cannot decide whether you are tragic, dangerous, or brilliant. Which one am I? Vivian smiled faintly over the rim of the porcelain cup. That depends entirely on what you do next. Serafina looked again toward the newspaper headlines spread across the table. Arthur Valecrest's name appeared everywhere now alongside investigations into shipping fraud and financial misconduct. Several political officials connected to Grayson operations had already resigned before dawn. Lucien moved quickly once he decided to destroy something. Where is he? She asked quietly. Vivian's green eyes lifted immediately. The Duke. You know perfectly well there is only one man everyone means when they say he now. Something approving flickered briefly across Vivian's face. In the West study with federal investigators. Serafina looked sharply toward her. Federal investigators? Apparently Lucien has been quietly collecting evidence against Grayson for years. Vivian stirred sugar slowly into her tea. Men with that level of patience should frighten everyone more than they currently do. Serafina lowered her gaze toward the newspaper again. 14 years. The hidden room still lingered vividly inside her thoughts. The files. The photographs. The impossible realization that someone had watched her disappear slowly and refused to let it happen entirely. You knew about the room, she said quietly. Vivian did not deny it. Partially. How partially? I knew Lucien investigated Grayson privately. She leaned back slightly beside the fire. I did not know he turned your existence into a long-term surveillance project. Serafina almost smiled faintly despite herself. That description somehow sounds both horrifying and strangely accurate. Lucien specializes in being horrifying accurately. Silence settled softly between them afterward. Snow continued drifting outside while warmth from the fireplace wrapped through the east wing. For the first time since arriving at Blackmore Hall, Serafina noticed she no longer felt afraid of the manor itself, only of what it meant to her now. Vivian watched her carefully across the room. You are thinking about him constantly. Serafina looked up immediately. No, yes. Vivian smiled without mercy. Fortunately, I enjoy observing emotional denial almost as much as public scandal. Serafina folded the newspaper carefully onto the table. He monitored my life for 14 years. True. That is not romantic. No, Vivian nodded calmly. It is deeply concerning. Despite herself, Serafina laughed softly. The sound surprised both of them. Vivian's expression gentled almost imperceptibly afterward. Lucien has spent most of his adult life believing attachment creates weakness, she said quietly. Then he met someone foolish enough to jump into freezing water for a stranger. Serafina looked toward the snow outside again. We were children. Children become adults carrying the same wounds. Vivian stood slowly from the chair beside the fire. The difference is whether they allow those wounds to harden them completely. A knock interrupted the room before Serafina could answer. Mrs. Holloway opened the door immediately afterward. "Miss Veilcrest," she said carefully. "His Grace requests your presence downstairs." Serafina felt her pulse quicken instantly despite herself. Vivian noticed. Of course she did. "There it is," she murmured softly. "That expression." "What expression?" "The one women get immediately before making terrible emotional decisions." Serafina ignored her entirely and followed Mrs. Holloway downstairs. The West study stood at the far end of Blackmore Hall overlooking the frozen river below. Federal investigators filled half the room speaking quietly beside stacks of ledgers and shipping records spread across massive oak tables. Several men stopped talking immediately when Serafina entered. Lucien stood near the windows in black as always, one hand resting behind his back while snow drifted softly beyond the glass behind him. He looked tired for the first time since she met him. Not physically exhausted, emotionally worn thin beneath control. The investigators began gathering papers quickly once they noticed her. Within minutes the study emptied almost completely until only Lucien remained beside the windows. Silence settled softly afterward. Serafina stopped several feet away from him. "Vivian says congratulations are appropriate." Something faintly resembling amusement touched his face briefly. Gone almost immediately. "Vivian says many dangerous things. Usually accurately." Lucien looked toward her fully then. His gray eyes appeared darker in daylight somehow. "How are you feeling?" The question entered the room quietly. Carefully. Serafina realized suddenly he asked it as though the answer mattered personally. "Less frozen than before." "Good." Silence followed. "Not uncomfortable exactly. Different now." Changed by hidden rooms and newspapers and truths finally spoken aloud beneath chandeliers. Serafina crossed slowly toward the windows overlooking the cliffs. "The investigators believe you," she said softly. "Yes. Because of the evidence." "Partially." Lucien's gaze shifted toward the snow outside. "Mostly because Grayson made enough enemies that people wanted reasons to destroy him." Serafina folded both hands lightly before her. "And my father?" Lucien remained silent several seconds before answering. "Arthur Veilcrest left Boston at dawn." She looked toward him sharply. "Where?" "Unknown." "You let him disappear." Lucien's expression hardened faintly. "No." He crossed toward the desk nearby and handed her a folded document. Serafina opened it slowly. A federal warrant bearing her father's name stared back from the page. Charges related to fraud, conspiracy, trafficking investigations. Her throat tightened painfully. "This is real." "Yes." "His life is over." Lucien's gaze rested steadily on her face. "He ended it himself." Serafina lowered the warrant slowly. She expected grief perhaps, or satisfaction. Instead she felt only emptiness settling quietly where fear once lived. "I keep thinking I should feel more devastated than this." Lucien said nothing. She looked toward the snow again. "What does that say about me?" "That survival eventually exhausts mourning." The answer landed gently enough to hurt. Serafina closed her eyes briefly. "You always speak as though pain is something measurable." "It usually is." "And love." Silence followed instantly. Serafina regretted the question the moment it escaped. Lucien became very still beside the windows. Outside, snow drifted endlessly across the cliffs and frozen river beyond Blackmore Hall. "Love," he said quietly at last, "is considerably less organized." Her pulse stumbled faintly beneath her ribs. Lucien looked toward her then with that same dangerous, unreadable focus. He carried the night he found her in the snow. Yet something else existed beneath it now. Something no longer entirely hidden. 14 years, she whispered softly. "You never intended telling me." "No, why?" Lucien crossed toward her slowly. "Not close enough to touch. Close enough for warmth to exist between them anyway. Because I did not want gratitude mistaken for affection." The honesty of it stole breath from her chest entirely. Serafina looked up at him through the pale winter light filling the study. "And now?" Lucien's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Vulnerability looked unnatural on him. Rare enough to become frightening. "Now," he said quietly. I no longer believe you would confuse the two. Silence surrounded them softly. No reporters. No investigations. No shouting voices beneath chandeliers. Only winter light and truth lingering carefully between two people who had spent years surviving separate loneliness without realizing it. Serafina studied the man before her slowly. Ruthless Duke. Relentless investigator. Terrifying strategist. The boy she once dragged from freezing water 14 years earlier without knowing his name. You carried me out of the snow yourself, she said softly. Lucien's gaze never left hers. Yes. Why? The question carried everything now. Not just the forest. All of it. 14 years. The hidden room. The East Wing. The quiet, impossible protection woven silently through her life long before she understood it existed. Lucien looked at her for several long seconds while snow drifted softly beyond the windows behind him. Then finally he answered with devastating simplicity. Because, he said quietly, I could not survive watching them leave you there twice. The room fell completely silent afterward. Serafina felt something inside her break open slowly beneath the weight of those words. Not fear. Not grief. Something warmer. More dangerous. She stepped toward him before caution returned. Lucien remained perfectly still as she reached upward carefully and touched his hand for the first time willingly. No accident. No rescue. Choice. His fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around hers. Outside Blackmore Hall the storm finally began fading beyond the cliffs. Inside the West Study, beneath pale winter sunlight and the quiet aftermath of ruined lies, Serafina realized something extraordinary with complete certainty. The most feared man in New England had spent 14 years protecting a girl the world considered forgettable. And somewhere along the way, without either of them fully noticing when it happened, she had become the only thing capable of frightening him in return.